Great. Okay. Let's see. Interesting. Just give me 1 second while I get this going. Here we go, good. Okay, so, great. Okay, so we are going to start in a few minutes. I started a little bit early, but just take your time and we'll wait for more people to join, or if not, then we'll start in about 5 minutes. So everyone just hold on for a moment, and the live chat is open. Excuse me while I open this bottle of water. Excuse me. And we shall start with this live stream discussion of the film Howard's End from 1992. And we'll start this discussion in a few moments. So please take your time and we'll go from there. So Mike Eli is here. Hello, Mike. Greetings from Las Vegas, and greetings to you in Las Vegas. I hope you're doing well, my friend. And I don't know what the situation is like in Las Vegas lately, but I hope I hope you're doing well. And Andrew Conger's here. Hello from Iowa, you say. So hello, greetings to you, Andrew. And Tim Holmes says greetings from London, one of the main settings of this film. Yes, indeed, my friend. Howard's End, part of the story, the film anyway, set in London, as you so astutely point out. So, looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this. So, but we'll just wait a few more minutes, and we'll get started in a second. So just hold on tight, my friends, and we'll start with the film club live stream in a moment. So I just wanted to start early just to be sure that there were no bugs. I hope the sound is okay. If there is any issue with the sound, please let me know. Or the picture quality, I hope their picture quality is okay. And we'll go from there. So Mike says, it's a very strange time, my friend. Your uploads have been tremendously helpful. Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry to hear that the times have been strange. Of course, I completely understand the reason why, because of this terrible, terrible situation that is confronting us all in one form or another. But that's really terrible. But yeah, and your uploads have been tremendously helpful. You say, well, thank you. That's very, very generous of you to say. So thank you very much for that kind comment. But for me too, it's been a little bit of an odd, strange, surreal time spent with many hours indoors, and so it's been a little bit of a I mean, it's also been an interesting time for self-reflection, and also just trying to get as much stuff done that I've had looming for a while now on this channel. But it's been pretty good. So okay, we're getting more people. Zyrother is here. Hello, John Adair's. Hello, hi from Belfast, Northern Ireland, guys. Hello, John. I hope you're well. And Mike says, I've been absent from the comments, but I appreciate all your comments. No, not a, thank you very much. And yeah, there's no pressure to put any comment in any video. I completely understand. Andrew says, I have the stream on my TV and I'm chatting from my phone. Sound and video are great. Thank you very much for confirming that, Andrew. I appreciate that. Once again, this live stream will be scheduled to begin at 11 p.m. Tokyo time, so about a minute and a half from now. And so just hold on tight, my friends, and we will proceed shortly. So once again with this film directed by James Ivory called Howard's End. So we'll get to that in a second. Just hold on tight, my friends. Okay, let's see. Just one more thing, and we'll get going. Oops. Okay. Great. Let's see. I know this is very exciting to watch someone drink water live. So hold on for one more second and then we will begin. Okay, so let's see. B-Side Records is here, hello. Elliot Cohen is here, hello. Andrew says, this film was not on my radar at all. I watched it for the first time last night. Glad you brought it to my attention. It was fantastic. Oh, that's great. Great. Skulder22 is here. Hello, hello, my friend. Okay, it's now 11 p.m. Tokyo time, so let us begin. Greetings from Tokyo, everyone. This is Daisuke, and I hope that this live stream finds you well. And thank you very much for tuning in, as always. So this is the live stream, film club live stream, where we will be discussing the film here from 1992 called Howard's End. This is a film that is directed by James Ivory, produced by Ismail Merchant, sometimes pronounced Ismail Merchant or Ismail Merchant, and with a screenplay by Ruth Jabvala. And this is based off of the novel, the early 20th century novel by E.M. Forster. It's sort of a depiction of Edwardian England, and in particular the story of three sets of families or couples, and in particular two families, and how they interact with each other and with a third set of characters, and how this interaction is all to do also with class and society, and also inheritance and land and power and morality, and ultimately to do with relationships and love and romance and family and wealth, and also poverty and yearning and class mobility and class warfare, and also how to understand other people, the relationship between the sexes, and how these relationships are carried through in their various incarnations as we see them in this particular film. That and so much more, I would contest, is at the heart of this film, Howard's End. So today let's talk about this film, and I'll try to explain a little bit as to why I chose this film, and why I really admire it so much. And along the way, I'd be very interested to hear any thoughts or comments that you might have with respect to this film. So before we get started in earnest, let me now just make the customary preliminary comments with respect to this, which is that the live stream is going to be about this particular film, Howard's End, and so this will be discussing the film in considerable detail. I'm not going to be talking about the novel and the differences between this particular Merchant Ivory adaptation and the novel. There are some differences, actually, and there are some things that the novel covers that the film does not cover, at least expressly. I've had the great pleasure of reading. It's one of my favorite works, novels anyway, and so I read it quite frequently, in fact. And so I find the writing to be quite interesting and sublime, and so I have a great interest in it. However, the focus of this particular live stream will be on the film itself, the Merchant and Ivory film, and so I won't be talking about the novel, unfortunately, in any great detail. if at all. So if you're looking for a discussion of the novel or comparative analysis, I'm not going to be performing that today. So maybe one day, I'm not sure. But it's, as I say, it's a novel that is well worth reading. And if you enjoyed this film, I mean, it might, I don't know, so some people might not think it's the most ideal thing to watch a film version first and then go to the novel, but I think there's a lot of merit to that. So if anyone is interested, if anyone watched this film and really enjoyed it, I would actually strongly recommend that you pick up the novel and read it. It's fairly short. It's not so long. It's not one of these large volumes of written English literature, and so it goes by fairly quickly. And so I would strongly suggest it if you're really interested and if you found yourself very moved by this particular work. So I will bring up actually maybe one particular thing about the novel that we don't see expressly in this film, but other than that, I won't be touching the novel in any direct way. So maybe some other time perhaps, but for now we'll be focusing on the Merchant Ivory film. And also, please note that I will be talking in detail about the film, Merchant Ivory film, Howard's End. And so if you have not seen this film, please don't watch the remaining part of this live stream. This live stream will be uploaded, I hope, automatically to the YouTube channel after it is done. And so if you want to watch the film, please watch the film, and you can always come back later. And it won't be live, of course, but you can always watch it as a video if you are interested. I strongly suggest that you do watch the film first. It's a film that has a lot of deep intricacies, and it has a lot of power and impact upon initial viewing, and it certainly did for me. And so I would strongly suggest watching the film first before getting into this particular live stream or video, whatever the case may be, because I will be talking about specific details, including the ending, etc. So again, if you haven't seen the film, I strongly urge you to turn off this live stream now, and you can come back anytime after the fact, after you've seen the film. And also, I should say that as with all the other films that I discuss here, I do not come to this particular discussion. I don't come to the table as any self-proclaimed expert in this film, and I don't have any self-proclamation as to being a film critic who has a strong grasp or understanding of this particular film. I don't. I just come to this film as an admirer of this film, because it's a work that I've seen actually many times since it was originally released, and so I encountered it quite young, and so I've seen it quite regularly ever since. And so I would say that I'm just approaching this as a fan, as a casual fan of this film, and not necessarily as any not necessarily as any one who has studied it deeply or who has written about it extensively or anything like that. But so therefore my comments might be somewhat shallow or incomprehensible or not necessarily comprehensive. And if you are looking for something more, I apologize for not being able to provide anything meatier. But there are many essays that have been written about it. There have been many reviews that have been written about it, and the Criterion release, unfortunately, is out of print. And so I don't know if it's worth it to you to try to find an OOP release of this somewhere used or something like that. But it is still available through other labels, of course, and so. It's definitely worth looking into, and there are materials online or books written about this film which have a deeper analysis than anything I could possibly provide. But in any event, my friends, I think this is a film that's well worth exploring further if you're interested, and so I would strongly suggest that. But again, I'm going to be doing the very best I can, but my best might not necessarily be good enough, but I will certainly try. And speaking of that, the live chat is open for anyone here who is interested in talking about this film. So you can talk to each other, you can open up conversations, etc. I've had no particular issues in the past about people disrespecting each other in the live chat. So if I trust and hope and know that the level of mutual respect will continue, and I know that everyone here will keep to that and abide by that, and so I know that I will not feel in any way disappointed by anyone's behavior or anything like that, because I never have and hopefully never will. So I just encourage that spirit of mutual respect to continue as always. That's not to say that we cannot disagree with each other. I think disagreement is actually very important. Very, very important, much more important than I think is given credit to, in fact. And you can disagree with people here, you can disagree with me. If you feel that someone is disagreeing with you, it's not necessarily that people are trying to troll you or trying to disrespect you. It's just disagreement is still a form of respect. And so even if someone is disagreeing with you, then don't worry about it. That's just, I think, an open invitation for further discussion. And then if you find people who agree with you in the chat, that's great. So in any event, my friends, the discussion is open. You can talk about this film, or you can talk about any other film in the Merchant Ivory catalog or anything of that nature. Just if you have any questions for me, please note that I won't be talking about any other film other than Howard's End. And so if you have any questions for me about a film other than Howard's End, then I won't be addressing it. And so you can always ask me in another video or leave a comment elsewhere or something like that, and I'll do my best to respond. But as far as today is concerned, I do want to focus my attention and energy on Howard's End. So the 1992 Merchant Ivory version of Howard's End. And I also won't be talking about any other film versions of this. I know that there's been maybe a series that was somewhat recent, and I won't be at all focusing on that. I will be focusing only on this film. I think there's enough here to talk about. There's so much to talk about this film. And with that, those are the preliminary stuff out of the way. So with that, and also one last thing. I will try to address everyone in the live chat, of course, but if I miss your question, or if I miss your comment, or I just miss mentioning you or anything like that, it's, again, not meant to, I didn't mean to do so intentionally. It's just that I'm just doing the best I can right here by myself. So I do make mistakes every now and again, or perhaps even more so. And so I will do my best to address everything in the comment section, that is, or the live stream live chat that is relevant to the Howard's End discussion, and I'll try to mention everyone who is here. But if I do forget to mention you, or if I overlook your comment, or if I miss mentioning you or anything like that, please don't take offense, and just know it was unintentional on my part. I will try to remedy it, or you can just gently remind me, and I'll try to get to your Howard's End related question or comment as soon as possible. But with that in mind, my friends, let us begin with my general opening with respect to this particular film, Howard's End, from 1992. So this is 1992, and I actually saw this when I saw this in 1992, and I was quite young. I was born in 1979. And so that makes me, when it came out, it was, what is it, I was 13 or so, so very, very young. And I saw it for the first time, not knowing anything about the novel, or not knowing anything about E.M. Forster per se, but I knew of the film because it had a very prominent release in North America at the time, because I was living in North America. And it was quite a striking work, because it was something that was obviously a kind of costume drama in the general sense of that term. A costume drama meaning a drama that's usually set in maybe Victorian England or Edwardian England or anything of that nature, if it's an English drama or British drama. And sometimes dealing with upper middle class or upper classes, aristocracy, and the like, and dealing with certain issues that pervade that slice of society, or slices of society, or strata of society, and that those sorts of concerns. And usually, and sometimes those dramas can even go one step further in trying to make concerns relevant to today's modern age, or the age of the contemporary viewer. And so I thought that this was a sort of costume drama, and thus, my whatever it was, my young teenage brain, when I first started to watch it, maybe I didn't quite register as much about it at the time. But by the time the film was proceeding at full speed through its many machinations of plot involving, very seemingly innocent encounters at the very beginning between the Wilcoxes and the Schlegels, and then those innocent encounters tend to develop and blow up into misunderstandings of what eventually become nothing, but they seem like the big deals at the time, but they end up becoming nothing. And then more ideas of life come in, and more interactions and coincidences and connections, only connect, as E.M. Forster said in the original source novel. Connections and coincidences and little quirks of fate come in to populate this particular story that creates a whole web of network of connections between or among these sets of people that we come to learn about and know throughout the course of the film, that as it grows and grows and grows and develops and turns up the heat when it comes to relative symbolisms or symbols that are used, and metaphors that are used, and these things are sort of woven into the fabric of the film, but then they find a conclusion, or find an arc, or they explode in quite a surprising fashion in many respects as the film progresses to its conclusion or denouement. And then by the time the film finished, I was quite taken aback by it, because I was still very young, and so I didn't necessarily appreciate all the nuances that it had to offer. But I felt that it was something that felt very immediate and quite direct to me, in the sense that I could understand, to a certain degree anyway, the impulses of I mean, when I say understand, I could maybe sympathize. Let me put it that way. I could sympathize as a viewer, those sorts of impulses that we see on screen about falling in love, or wanting to get into a relationship, or family, and feeling, maybe some family members go a little bit too far, or we have affection for them, but sometimes they might irritate us, or something of that nature. Or some family members we don't necessarily get along with, personality-wise, personality traits are different, etc. So I could understand that level of storytelling as I saw it as a young kid. And at the time as well, this film, as I say, got a really big push in terms of marketing and North American theater releases. And I think also that year it was a pretty big film in terms of Academy Award attention. And so it got a number of significant awards during those ceremonies, and and this was the time when I was still watching the Academy Awards, and so this was something that really further cemented and solidified its stature to me at that age. And then as the film, or as I grew up and I drifted away from the film a little bit, I drifted more towards E.M. Forster and the writings of E.M. Forster. When I was in college, I read a lot of his works. And I still watch this film intermittently or occasionally, but it was still something that I didn't necessarily watch every single day. But as time grew, I really began to find more affection and appreciation for this film. Not that I didn't have it before, but it was something that I really started to respect more and more every time I saw it. And every time I saw it, I was always struck by how moved I was by the particular relationships and how they developed or how they exploded and really just they disintegrated before our very eyes in such tragic ways. And I'm not only talking about the way in which the Leonard Bass character ends up towards the end of the film, which is a very tragic plot thread of the narrative, as all of you know. I'm not talking only about the thread in terms of the Wilcoxes in particular, Henry Wilcox, the Anthony Hopkins character. I'm not only talking about the thread in terms of the Schlegels, Margaret Schlegel and Helen Schlegel, Emma Thompson and Helena Bonham Carter, respectively. And also we'll throw in Tibby there as well, because he's part of the Schlegel clan. But also just the breakdown of relationships that are sewn back up together again, even down to in terms of maybe the more prominent relationships between the sisters, the Schlegel sisters, how that relationship is in one place at one part of the film, and then it breaks down quite significantly around the middle part of the film, coinciding quite on purpose, I think, with the fact that Margaret Schlegel and Henry Wilcox get together sometime after Ruth Wilcox passes away, and then once those events happen and they coincide with the re-emergence of Leonard Bass into the equation and all he has to offer, and the Porphyrion and all that subplot involving his job at the Porphyrion Insurance Company and how Henry Wilcox affects that. But that's another issue that I'll try to get to later. We see the breakdown of the Schlegel sisters' relationship, but then it's interestingly built up again. And I think this is a pattern that I began to notice in this film as I got older, which is that the film is about certain societal tendencies and about certain tensions, and also, as I would suggest, not just class mobility, but also class warfare, and class warfare on a very nasty and cruel stage. But also, this is, I think, at a very fundamental level, a film about relationships and the breakdown of relationships, and then the reemergence or the rebuilding of those relationships into something that is different and new and not of the old. Maybe it's better than the old, maybe it's not better than the old, but I'm not sure. We see the breakdown, we see the relationships of the Schlegel sisters break down and then rebuild itself up by the film's conclusion. We see the emergence of the relationship between Margaret Schlegel and Henry Wilcox. It starts out in a certain way, and then it turns into a quite a different relationship around the middle of the film, and then it really breaks down around the end of the film, and then at the film's epilogue, it turns into something completely different and sort of rebuilt in a kind of different, almost. It's almost as though a new rapprochement has emerged, or a détente has occurred between the two parties, as it were, and it's turned into a different sort of marriage. But we're not privy to those details during the epilogue, as you know, which I'll also try to get to later. So I saw the film as a kind of examination of relationships that exist, break down, and then reemerge or become rebuilt over the course of time. And so on that level, I found it to be a very immediate and arresting drama that I could really engage with. And then also, just in terms of the artistry and craftsmanship of this film, I saw the images to be very beautiful and lovely, but they weren't of a kind of shiny, sunshiny sort of loveliness that one might have an image of in terms of Merchant Ivory films. In fact, I was always struck by how drab everything was. Even in the sunshine, rain would sometimes fall, but there was a beauty in that, and sometimes some of the shots of Howard's End, especially during the middle when Howard's End is glorified, and we see shots of flowers after Ruth Wilcox passes on. We see the world in its rain-soaked beauty, almost solemnity, and I think that kind of color palette is more or less consistent through the film. It's not 100% consistent, I grant you. There are moments of sunshine and there are moments of sort of a natural splendor that is made heightened by the way that the cinematography is shooting the scene. But I would suggest that it's a kind of a picture quality or depiction of this sort of lifestyle that I think is aiming for sort of realistic quality on the one hand, with the costumes and the way of life and the carriages and the props and all that stuff, which I think is great on the one hand, but it's also aiming for a kind of heightened drama or a poetic cinematic drama, which we see a glorified idealistic version of Howard's End, which represents so much in the film, as you know. And we see the characters interact with each other. As I say, it's a world of coincidences. I mean, in real life, we wouldn't have all the, I would think we wouldn't have all these coincidences occur, but we have so many coincidences amongst these three strata of society. The Wilcoxes, the Schlegels, and the Basts. And all these coincidences couldn't exist in real life, I would suggest. But that's not the point of the film. The point of the film is to present realistic elements mixed in with the heightened elements of drama. And that creates something that will engender a feeling of emotion or other kind of emotional response in the viewer. So all this stuff began to swell inside my very being, I suppose, when I started to watch it over and over and over again, and then it just became one of those films that I could just watch and just immediately attach myself to. And even now, when I watch it, it becomes a film that is so easily recognizable to me, and it fills me with a lot of hope and a lot of sadness and resignation towards life on the one hand, and also a sense of, as I say, renewal or rebirth or regeneration in terms of the relationships that existed but then broke down and were destroyed but then were rebuilt over the course of the film. And we see a lot of that, actually, and I really admire that I admire the film for its attempt to balance all these different elements in one presentation, as this film is Howard's End. So this is my general statement on Howard's End, which I think is a really splendid work. I should say also that I know that, and I do this too. I know sometimes people spell the title as Howard's, Howard apostrophe S, Howard's End, as in the end of Howard, I suppose, a possessive. But in fact, there is no apostrophe. So whenever you speak of this film, and I always try to do this as well, I sometimes autocorrect on an iPhone or computer tends to put in the apostrophe, but that's an error. So there is no apostrophe in the title. It's always Howard's End without an apostrophe. So whenever you speak of the film, if possible, always don't use the apostrophe, because I understand the reasoning why some people might do that, and it's a very innocent thing. It's no biggie at all, but it's just a little detail. It's Howard's End without the apostrophe. So, but that is sort of my general impression of this film going forward. So. I will talk about specific aspects of this film and why I think it's important. But I will just go to the chat right now and see what is going on. So let me just go here and let's see. All right. John Adair says, I got the movie on in the background as well. Great. Zyrother says, this was the second time I watched it. First time I did not really care for, but this time around I was very impressed. Very interesting, Zyrother. I wonder what was the thing or things about the film that turned you around on it. That's very interesting, because I do remember you mentioned in a comment on a past video, I think, announcing this live stream, that maybe you didn't necessarily engage with it at first, but I'd be very interested to hear the reasons. Very interesting. Let's see. And Tim follows up with that and says, I agree, this film gets better with rewatches. You notice a lot more details. That's very true, Tim. Ruggiero Antonacci says, hello everyone tuning in right now. Thank you very much, my friend. Tim Holm says, and the quality of the performances is really remarkable. And Wolf Gratz is here, good day. Brian McGuire is here, hello. And Zyrother says, I only own the Laserdisc version, but it is quite beautiful. And then Elliot says, the Merchant Ivory collaborations are some of my favorite films of all time. And Rogero says, we'll catch the previous live stream eventually. Oh, great. Thank you very much. Let me just return to something that Tim Holm was saying. The quality of the performances is really remarkable. Let me get this point. Thank you, Tim, for reminding me about this, but this is something that's very important. The performances are spectacular. They are all very spectacular. They are very different, each in its own way. And the characterizations, I think, are quite impressive. Here it is. So let's start with, I want to focus on Emma Thompson last, because I think her Margaret Schlegel is the heart and soul of the film in many ways. Of course, there are many other key characters in the film, but Margaret Schlegel is the key component of this film. But let's save a discussion on Margaret Schlegel for a little bit later. But in terms of the performances, I think we have a selection or a collection of characters that is a... hold on. Sorry about this. There's one thing. Yep. Okay. Very good. So I'm sorry. What was I? So the collecting the actors that appear in this film, I think, are all doing a really splendid job. And let's talk about, for instance, Vanessa Redgrave as Ruth Wilcox, who is, of course, the wife of Henry Wilcox, played by Anthony Hopkins. And if we're thinking about the Wilcoxes, we also have talking about the family. We have Charles Wilcox, and then Evie Wilcox, and then Paul Wilcox. So those are the children. So Evie Wilcox is played by Gemma Redgrave, and then Paul Wilcox is Joseph Bennett, and then Charles Wilcox is played by James Wilby, which is an excellent turn by the actor James Wilby, especially if you know the film Morris and his performance there. I won't speak more about that, but his turn as Charles Wilcox is actually... It's really one of the great, almost quasi-villains of the film, perhaps. I'm not sure. I wouldn't necessarily call him a villain, but he is one of the more antagonistic forces of the film, especially as the film races towards its conclusion at Howard's End, and with that terrible scene with the Schlegel father's sword and his relationship, Charles's relationship with the father, or as he calls him, the pater, Henry Wilcox, is one of the key components that drives his particular character to do what it is he eventually does in the film. But that performance in particular is quite stunning, I think. There is a certain way that he opens his eyes to express disagreement and discomfort, but he can never express it because he knows that he is powerless against his father. And even though it's quite obvious that there is a somewhat sense of disdain that Charles Wilcox has towards Margaret Schlegel, and after Margaret Schlegel marries Henry Wilcox, there's still that disdain from the son, but still he's powerless to say anything, at least out loud. And so there is that extra added sense of pressure and stress, I suppose, that Charles Wilcox as a character expresses. And it's all portrayed rather brilliantly in James Wilby's demeanor and posture, and the way he's just overeager with things, and he's kind of almost unwittingly villainous, or somewhat stupidly villainous, especially towards the end there, when he just unwittingly reveals that he used the sword, the side of the saber, against Leonard Bass. They just tapped him, what did he say, once, maybe twice. And he just says this of his own volition, where he didn't even have to say it, of course, but it was one of the things that led to, of course, his downfall of perhaps being convicted of manslaughter, or maybe even more, in the words of Henry Wilcox. So, but that's a really fine performance in terms of the Wilcoxes anyway. And also Gemma Redgrave as Evie, she also has a bit of how should I put it? There's a kind of innocent spite to her daughter performance. And remember, she is the one who, when the family are sitting around the table in Howard's End after Ruth Wilcox has passed away, and the issue of the note that Ruth Wilcox has written on her deathbed, essentially bestowing her right of ownership in the property of Howard's End to Margaret Schlegel. The family, the Wilcox family, sitting around the table, of course, deciding what to do with the note. And while Henry Wilcox is at the head of the table, essentially asserting that they should just discard the note, it's really, right, it's Evie who initiates the actual throwing of the note in the fire. And so she has a kind of innocent spite to her, almost a somewhat a rose-tinted sense of venom to her, I would say. It's also expressed later when they're at the restaurant. What was the restaurant's name? Simpson's, I think. And it was it was her and her fiance at the time, and then it was Henry Wilcox and Margaret Schlegel. And this was where Henry begins to try to court Margaret. And remember, it's the four of them, and there's that scene where Margaret says, "Oh, I could eat heaps. I want to have fish pie," but Henry Wilcox basically says, "I'm not going to let you have fish pie. You're going to have like roast beef and Yorkshire pudding or something like that." So that's sort of the beginning of Henry essentially asserting his will and control over Margaret Schlegel in a very subtle way, and she sort of goes along with it. But during that time, you could there's a little bit where it cuts to Evie and the fiance Cahill, and then it just never stops talking or something like that. And so they're sort of silently making fun of Margaret Schlegel. But then in the next moment, the two of them are just as equally as sort of almost silly in their talk about, oh, you like cheese, no, you don't like cheese, no, you like cheese, that sort of thing. So she's sort of there's a rose-tinted venom to her character, which is also mirrored back on her. So I don't think we're necessarily meant to see her as a wholly sympathetic character, but I think the performance by Gemma Redgrave is actually quite stunning and really good. And while we're at the topic of the Wilcoxes, we should, of course, focus in on Ruth Wilcox, Mater Wilcox, right? Played with such solemnity and almost an ethereal calm, almost a heavenly, divine sense of will, as portrayed by Vanessa Redgrave in this, because it's quite a difficult performance in many respects, because the film is on the one hand meant to be, as I say, a film that is trying to capture these details and the real life stuff, all the way down to the amount of scones that Tibby is not meant to eat during tea time. Or the little details about when he's up at Oxford or something like that, or the things about the shopping and the horse-driven carts and the little details at Howard's End, the types of flowers that exist, and the teeth in the bark, right, and all this stuff. These are the little details that make up the life of the world, right. But Ruth, in an interesting way, she almost is a character that has to almost, even in life, she almost floats above it. She's sort of a figure that floats as she moves, and she's almost someone who is not of this particular time. She was a character that is, of course, meant to represent a time that is past. She always thinks about Howard's End. She has a certain sense of how should I put it? She has places a great deal of importance on the identity of self as expressed through things and through the environment, and in particular in one's house and in one's place where one was born. That's why she is so devastated when Margaret tells her that the place where Margaret and her sister and her brother are living, they must move out in whatever it was, 18 months at the time that the two women were having that conversation, because the lease will expire, and the building will be torn down, and a new building, new living spaces will be constructed. And so there's this idea of the quaintness and beauty of the lived-in space that Ruth Wilcox in particular really values. And she values this, of course, because of the importance that she bestows, or that she grants to the image and the symbol that is Howard's End, the property that she owns outright. It's not Henry's house, it's Ruth's house that was bequeathed to her from her brother, and we understand that her brother died. I think the details were died in India, and then after the death, the house was bequeathed to Ruth Wilcox, and so Ruth Wilcox owns the house, and so. But it's a very important part of her life, obviously, and in many ways it is her identity, and so it's this idea of a thing that is used as a vehicle or vessel to represent the essence of a particular human being. We see that not only in cinema, but we see that also in real life as well. And that's the importance of property in many respects. It's a symbol of power, it's a symbol of control and dominance, of course, when you're talking about property and industrial societies versus agrarian societies, or the rise of the capitalist state, etc. But it's also, despite all that, it's still, for Ruth, it's not necessarily this function of ownership and wealth, but it's a symbol of who she is and what it is she is about, which makes her viewpoint on Howard's End, I think, very, very symbolic. And thus her character, as portrayed by Vanessa Redgrave, needs to be set off from the rest of the pack, because, of course, as we know, the rest of the Wilcoxes don't necessarily see Howard's End in the same kind of deep-rooted way that Ruth looks at Howard's End. People like Henry Wilcox and Charles, and maybe to a certain extent even Evie, but in particular Charles and Henry look at it as kind of an expression of ownership, and the expression of ownership of property, rather than the expression of the individual spirit. And so I think those are two different ways of looking at something, and I think those represent two different poles that are being combined here, which therefore makes Vanessa Redgrave's performance even more key, because she needs to be further set off from that sort of hard-willed mindset that is expressed by Charles, and I think more vehemently by Henry Wilcox. And so the Vanessa Redgrave performance is very key, and her death, the character's death, which occurs about a third of the way through the film, I think, is very important too, because her loss, or the loss of her character from the film, means that the place of Howard's End gains even more prominence and more stature and more importance in the context of the narrative, not only in the specific elements of the narrative with regards to the inheritance and hiding the inheritance. In fact, Margaret Schlegel Ruth really intended to have Margaret, or have the house bequeathed to Margaret, but instead the Wilcoxes, through their sort of chicanery, decided to destroy the note or any other evidence which would have proven at least some kind of intention on Ruth's part to leave the house to someone other than the Wilcox family. So, but her performance, Vanessa Redgrave's performance, needs to be, it needs to be ethereal, it needs to be feathery, it needs to be heavenly, it needs to be almost angelic and innocent, to the point that it's almost antiquated, right? There's the great early scene where Ruth is invited to the Schlegel, or Margaret Schlegel's, one of her sort of intellectual gatherings with her other intellectual friends, and the suffrage movement is one of the subjects that comes up, and this is the moment where world peace is also coming up, and Ruth Wilcox makes two comments which are have a kind of an impact. One is she makes the comment of how it's her view that if all the mothers of the nations came together, then that would be the end of war. And then the other comment she makes is, you know, I feel, and I'm paraphrasing, but she says, I feel only all too thankful and grateful that all the decisions can be left to men, and I don't have to worry about voting. And which goes completely against the whole notion of the suffrage movement, which obviously was something that was still in the grand scheme of society, and the tides of society was still something that was gaining steam during the period that we're seeing depicted here. But the fact that she's making these comments is suggestive of a kind of almost an innocent charm, a quiet naivete, but also an echoing of a kind of antiquated past that she obviously represents. And so it's almost clear that she really has no place in this modern world. And so her death is not only tragic, but it's also narratively symbolic. And thus her death makes the property of Howard Zinn even more symbolic, and thus drives or propels the plot forward to its inexorable conclusion. So that's just my long-winded way of saying that Vanessa Redgrave's performance is one of the key performances of the film. But that's sort of the Wilcox side, and I'll try to get to the other Wilcox, which is Henry Wilcox, who is played by Anthony Hopkins, which is one of the best Anthony Hopkins performances I've ever seen. And you know, a lot of people obviously recall with great fondness, of course, that I think the film that he did before this film was The Silence of the Lambs, which is, of course, his most iconic role, I think, in terms of the public consciousness. And don't get me wrong, his performance in The Silence of the Lambs is quite epic. But I think in many ways, his Henry Wilcox is quite complex, and of just a totally different package altogether. And so I'll talk about Henry Wilcox in a moment, and then also in a moment I'll, of course, try to focus in on the Basts and also on the Schlegels. But that's just my general take on at least part of the Wilcox clan. But anyway, before I continue, let me go to the live chat here. Okay, Brian McGuire, Wolfgratz and Brian McGuire, I said hello, but I'll say hello again. And Evie is here. Hello, Evie. And John Adair says, when I was young, I would never watch Merchant and Ivory productions, as I had it in my head, that they were the equivalent of a Mills and Boon movie. Okay. Yeah, there is actually, I understand what your comment is, and it's actually very interesting. Merchant and Ivory, I won't go into the details of the other Merchant and Ivory films, but the span of Merchant and Ivory is actually very vast. And in many ways, it for a lot of people, it almost culminates in this period where we had films in the 80s and 90s, starting with, I think, A Room with a View, and then also Morris and Howard's End and Remains of the Day, etc. But the trajectory of Merchant and Ivory is quite vast, and actually it goes off into some areas not involving James Ivory, for instance. So it's pretty interesting. I always thought one day that actually one of the first things I always wanted to do to start this YouTube channel was to go through all of the Merchant Ivory films, but it never materialized. But they are really great, you know. Well, I'm sorry, I should stop myself, because otherwise I will just go on the Merchant Ivory films. But anyway, let's see. Gloinda Hobbit is here. Hello. Thanks for the live stream. No, thank you for joining, my friend. It's always a pleasure to see you. Cooper Glover, 1972, our dear friend, hello. Let's see. And Wolfgrat says, nope, it's not a triple-decker or doorstep of a novel. I was referring to the length of the novel, yes, and I was referring to the fact that it wasn't long, relatively speaking. It goes by rather briskly, so anyone who is interested in the novel, I strongly suggest it. Again, only connect, my friends, only connect. Don Pride is here. Hello, it's nice to see you, my friend. Let's see. Yes, Tim Holmes says, Howard's End has some of the loveliest cinematography in the Home Merchant Ivory catalog. Yes. Let's see, just scrolling down here. Okay. Let's see. Cooper Glover, 1972 says, I watched this last night on Netflix. Oh, great. Great. Cooper Glover, 1972 continues, it took a while to get into, but then it got interesting. Great. Matt S. is here. Hello. Let's see. Zyrother says, what I noticed this time around was how time is dealt with. Big jumps in time are invisible. Suddenly we are a year in the future, but sometimes short jumps in time are very obvious. Yeah, that's interesting too. Yeah, and I will try to get to that a little bit. There is a certain sort of unspoken sense of time progression, and we do see certain title cards. For instance, after the initial episode with at Howard's End, between the younger son Paul and Helen, and their sort of romance that ended up not being. And all the mishap and miscommunication and happenstance that occurred from that little episode, which I think is a very symbolic episode, by the way. But after that is over, it says a few months later or something like that. And then also at the end, after the events and after Charles has been convicted and Leonard Bass has been killed, it says the following summer or something like that. So, and it goes to the scene with the Wilcoxes and including Margaret, just confirming the details of the finalized, revised will of Henry Wilcox, bequeathing the house of Howard's End to Margaret, who would then agree to, in turn, at her death, bequeath the house to her nephew, who is now the son of Helen Schlegel, who by this time has given birth to her son, who is also the son that of Leonard Bast. So, so time has a certain way of progressing, but we also see time jumps in interesting ways here in terms of the fade outs to black, but also we see facial hair changed. Leonard Bast at the beginning doesn't have facial hair, during the time when he encounters the Schlegels for the first time, through the fateful event that one day, rainy day, music and meaning, and the inadvertent taking of the umbrella with it's all broken at the seams, right? And so and then later we see him with a mustache. And so we understand that time has passed. We also know that at the time that he met the Schlegels for the first time, he wasn't married to Jackie, because we realize that his brother was getting in the way, and he has to wait until he's 21 in order to be able to marry Jackie. And then by the time we see him again, we understand that some years have passed perhaps, and then he has by this time married Jackie. And so it's all a very interesting situation and setup, I think. But what was I saying? So in other words, the passage of time, I think, is as you say, it's very elliptical, but it's also done in a kind of standardized way with title cards, but not all the time. But so you're very right to bring it up. And then Cooper Glover, 1972, says, it was interesting to see the evolution of the Anthony Hopkins character, Henry Wilcox, how he had no pity for poor people or the lower classes, but he wasn't revealing that he slept with Mrs. Bast, Jackie, right? So this was an affair that he had 10 years ago. Or, what did he say? He says, right, 10 years ago, right? So 10 years ago. And so this is a good opportunity, I think, to go to Henry Wilcox, and then by extension I'll try to go to the Schlegels. But Henry Wilcox, I think, is one of the most complicated characters in all of Merchant Ivory filmography, and certainly in the context of Howard's End, as depicted by Anthony Hopkins here. And the reason is, I think, what Cooper Glover 1972 was alluding to, was his outlook on society is one thing that affects his personal relationships with those around him. He has a very patriarchal view of society, in that he has this way of viewing the world as being a place where essentially it's the men that do the work and make the decisions, and that the women, through some kind of folly, don't know what's good for them. That's the sort of that's a very basic way to explain the sort of strict patriarchal view of the world that I think Henry espouses. And I don't think it's necessarily I don't think it's depicted in a way that's meant to depict him as a kind of villain of the piece. I don't think he's a villain at all. I think he's very much a victim as much as anyone else. But that's his viewpoint, which is, of course, going at loggerheads. It's really going against, very abrasively, I would say, the sort of viewpoint of Margaret Schlegel in particular. And it's really amazing to me that Margaret Schlegel would have agreed to marry Henry the way she did. But I think there's a reason for that, and I'll try to get to that when I talk about the Schlegels. But it's his view on life is, as you say, quite strict, and it's very it's almost to the point of being Darwinian. And and he tries to sound humanistic, but at the same time he is very cold, and he has no inkling of the sort of effect that his viewpoint would have. I should also mention that it's not necessarily made clear in the film, but there are hints to the fact that the Wilcoxes are not necessarily aristocracy. We're not necessarily talking about landed aristocracy or any kind of deep aristocratic lineage of the Wilcoxes, at least nothing that's depicted in the film outwardly. But we get the sense that all of his wealth has been generated more or less through commercial ventures and commercial means. The rubber company and his business interests, which we understand involve maybe Nigeria and other parts of Africa, etc. during this time. And so and also property as well. But we also understand that the family is not wholly wealthy, in the sense that all the wealth seems to be focused in on Henry and his commercial ventures, but his children do not necessarily seem to have their own independent wealth. It's all derived from the pater, and so this is an indication of their wealth being not necessarily from a landed aristocracy, but from what might be deemed to be, I don't even know if it's upper class. I would actually refer to it as an upper middle class, an upper middle class, but it's still very, very wealthy, and so that's I think the general position that Henry finds himself in. He's also seemingly well versed in finance and insurance industries, given his little bit of insider information about the Porphyrion that he seemingly innocently gives to the Schlegels that one night. But he is also a man who has a very complicated nature. He seems to be someone who doesn't feel comfortable expressing his emotions. He also does not like the idea of scandal or even the whiff or hint of scandal. And what I mean by whiff or hint is he doesn't even like the possibility of idle chit-chat gossip to to even threaten the perception of his existence as perceived by the society around him. So he also places great value in having a clean reputation, shall we put it, to the point that when he is arguing with Margaret in the yard, when Dolly, Charles's wife, is there, and I think she's in the yard looking after one of the children, and she's just witnessing the two of them at the distance having an argument. And later, Henry has to see to it that when he's talking to Charles, he says, please note that we are not having an argument. It's just, it's that sort of thing. So he's really concerned about his reputation, and I think he understands that his place in society is in many ways linked to his wealth and his position in society. And so I think he sees that any threat to that position in terms of any kind of scandal or even the whiff of scandal and anything that he might have done in reality in terms of his affair with Mrs. Bass, Jackie, this cannot come out into the open because he's very much closed and he's very much someone who is hermetically sealed, and he can't let that stuff out. He can't let his past out, and he can't let his emotions out. And I think that creates further friction between himself and the people around him. Not necessarily, well, it creates friction, but in the sense of the Wilcoxes, there's a sense of his dominance in the family. Whatever he says goes. And so, when Charles is talking, is in the room, and they're talking about Helen and how she might be sick, right? Helen has been away and she hasn't come back to England for some time. She's been away in Germany, and they've only been getting these postcards of these little snippets of information, but they've never met her for over, I think, 4 months or so. And so they're all talking in Henry Wilcox's office, and Charles comes in, and Charles makes a flippant remark about Helen and about we, and then Henry says, "We, pray Charles, what do you mean by we?" And that's his way of being aggressive against Charles for any kind of affront that Henry senses that Charles may be willing to make against his wife, who is now Margaret. And so, Henry is also a very, I would say, he sees himself as a kind of gallant gentleman of old, perhaps, as a kind of man of honor. And I think he sees that this kind of honor expressed in his relationship and his marriage to Margaret, and then also by extension he sees that this idea of marriage and having children in wedlock, and also having a sort of a period of courtship, and also having children who are successful and being successful, and how that is all important to his, how that is something that for his point of view is very important, because it's all about the exterior, it's all about how he is being perceived by people around him. And so anything that will threaten that, whether it be Helen's acts and bringing the Basts to Evie's wedding reception, or staying at Howard's End when she's obviously with child but not married, and these sorts of things, which are really an overextension of Henry's, the importance that he places on these outward extensions or outward visible marks of societal position, to the point where it really essentially almost destroys his relationship and marriage with Margaret, because it means essentially that that overemphasis on this idea of honor, as far as Henry sees it, is really threatening to drive a permanent wedge between himself and Margaret, because it is really destroying the relationship that Margaret is having with her sister Helen. But this is, I think, the exterior posture that Henry adopts, but of course it's broken down in two key places in the film. The first place being when he is first confronted by, or not, I'm sorry, three places. Let me correct myself. The first place is when Ruth dies, or she is about to die, and he is just sitting there in the hospital or the medical clinic in the chair, and he's just sitting there really grief-stricken. You can tell that he really loves Ruth, because it's the moment where he's sitting there, and then Margaret comes after having visited Ruth on her hospital bed, and she just very gently taps Anthony Hopkins on the shoulder. You can see him just be startled almost, and it's that wonderful moment of a real vulnerability that he shows, and then he tries to compose himself yet again. He tries to stand up, but Margaret won't let him, and he allows that. And then there's the second moment when Mrs. Bast comes in to Evie's wedding, and she is now drunk after having had champagne and punch and whatever, and she recognizes Henry, and Henry suddenly has a sort of a fit, an explosion of anger, at least from his from the perspective of his character. It's actually quite a violent outburst. And he sort of accuses Margaret of wanting to trap him and all that sort of stuff. And then after that, it is revealed that he had an affair with her. What was it, when she was in Cyprus, I think it was. But and she was out there quite young, and so there's a bit of an issue or confusion as to exactly how old she was as well, and that's never really explored in the film. But the point is that, yes, he did have an affair, and that this is something that he's obviously ashamed of. But rather than necessarily, there's a moment when he's sort of asking for forgiveness, but then even as he's asking for forgiveness, he doesn't allow himself to forgive Helen or allow the Basts any kind of leeway. All that Margaret was asking for was to have Henry find Leonard Bast a job, but even that is something that Henry won't do. He refuses to do, even after he has been exposed like this. And so it sort of reveals that he is very adamant in his ways, even when he is at his most vulnerable. However, the third and I think most telling moment where Henry lets his guard down, or his guard is absolutely shattered, is of course towards the end when Leonard Bast is killed by well, let me not say by Charles, but after the encounter that Charles and Leonard Bast have in the one of the rooms of Howard's End. There's the scuffle, and then Leonard Bast dies, and then of course this leads to the final one of the final confrontations with between Margaret and Henry out in the lawn. And this is the moment where Margaret wants to give back the keys and says, "I'm leaving you. My life is with Helen now." And Henry wants to talk, but then she says, "Okay, but it'll have to be here on the lawn." And they have that wonderful moment when the two of them sit down. Margaret rather forcefully kneeling, but then on this side of the frame you have Anthony Hopkins as Henry Wilcox, almost crumpling to the ground. He's just broken. It's that moment where he just loses his footing, and he just catches himself with his arm. It's a really beautiful acting moment. And then there's a strand of hair that it just hangs down like that, and it's so telling. And I think that's one of the things. It's like he's doing so much acting just with that little strand of hair, and he has that gesture with his hand. He can't let Margaret see him at his most vulnerable and broken and crying, because he acknowledges that Charles, it won't be, the coroner won't give a report, won't give a decision that Leonard Bast died of heart failure, but in fact it will probably be as a result of manslaughter, if not more. And he says he can't bear tell Charles because Charles is so naive and almost stupid to realize the gravity of his own situation. But Henry is very smart. He knows exactly what's going on. He perceived it almost immediately. And so he's broken at that moment. He's ultimately a broken man. And you can see the expression on Emma Thompson's face at that moment. Her face just subtly transforms into a completely different register of emotion, because up until then she was so cold and determined to leave Henry, but at that moment her face changes, and then time jumps, and then we realize that they are still together. And so we understand that something in that moment changed her heart as a character, and it was that witnessing of the ultimate breakdown and broken state of Henry Wilcox, I would contend, which is part of the catalyst of that movement towards their togetherness. And so I think those are the three moments that I think show a real breakdown of the character. And that's what I meant when I said that this film is, in one way anyway, a film about relationships that are established, broken, and then rebuilt at the film's end. And so I think this is the moment where this is the what's the word, nadir. This is the lowest ebb of the relationship, but then it's the lowest ebb also for Henry Wilcox as well, and it gets rebuilt in terms of the epilogue, because we know that they are still together, but there is, I'm not sure exactly what the relationship is in terms of their romantic relationship, or what kind of romantic feelings that Margaret has towards him, but there is still signs of affection, and she does kiss him, and she does hug him, and she does hold him, and then the film ends like that. And so this is an idea, I think, of the brokenness of a particular man, Henry Wilcox. He is built up and then broken, then rebuilt again. And also the relationships that he has with Margaret is going through the same kind of establishment, brokenness, and then reestablishment process. And so I think this is a real beautiful trajectory that we see in terms of Henry Wilcox, and that's why I think, in a nutshell anyway, that's why I think he's the most one of the most complicated characters, and that Wilcox clan is quite I mean, also just in terms of acting, it's a real masterclass in acting, and that there's also a wonderful moment when they're in the trading company offices, and Margaret is there, and then all of a sudden Henry does a little jig with Margaret there, which is so almost out of character, it's quite stunning. But he suddenly composes himself when Charles enters the room. I just love moments like that, and he is not a villain, right? He is also just a tender. He is a tender man who has a certain love for his children, and also for his first wife Ruth, and also for his second wife Margaret. And so I think that's a really I think his character is not a villain at all, but really interesting. All right, so let me just stop there and continue on. Let's see here. Okay. Wolfrat says, yes, and people disappear for quite long periods, especially Helen, but also Mr. Wilcox isn't visible for long periods at the start. I think you're talking about just a follow-up to the whole idea of passages of time, I think. Zyrotha says, I don't think Henry ever evolved. His last lines in the film are a blatant lie about the note. Actually, I would very gently maybe push back a little bit on that, Zyrotha. I understand what you're saying, but you know, I think it was, I don't know if it was a blatant lie. It could be seen as a lie, but it was also a truth, in the sense that this was something that actually happened. And remember, up to now, he had never mentioned it before. And so, I mean, the fact that he's mentioning it now, of course, the results are the same, of course. I mean, the house eventually goes to Margaret anyway. And so this is probably something that is, you know, withholding the information is going to serve him no strategic use anyway. So he might as well say it. What's the harm anyway? And so there might be something in that. But there's also a bit of tenderness in that moment too, because he's also much older. We understand that maybe a year or so has passed since the traumatic events of at Howard's End, but we can see that he has aged quite considerably. There's a certain weakness, frailty in his demeanor and his posture that you can tell almost immediately. So it could be the onset of some kind of old age as well, and the like. But I look at that moment as being a moment of a sort of intimate moment, and there's not much spoken in that. In fact, he doesn't even go into the detail. If you notice exactly what he says, again, I'm paraphrasing. He says, my poor Ruth, in her dying days, wrote your name on a piece of paper. Knowing her not to be yourself, I set it aside. Didn't do wrong, did I? All right. So he doesn't say anything about the house. All he says is, my poor Ruth in her dying days wrote your name on a piece of paper, and that's all he says. And so it's kind of an incomplete explanation, because if someone said to me that line, the thing I would ask is, what are you talking about? What do you mean by paper? What did she say? What is this referring to? And of course, this is all cinematic shorthand for the whole narrative element, which was that Ruth actually did leave the house of Howard's End to Margaret. At least that was her intention. And so I think that's the I see that moment actually in a more optimistic way. But I do also appreciate the viewpoint that it could be seen as a lie. Although, yeah, I don't. Maybe some people see that as being him being not changing, but actually, I do see it as an indication of him having a changed core. But let's see. And Zyrother says, let's see. Tim says it seems like he was stubborn right up to the end. And Kruber Glover 1972 says he changed his mind on giving Howard's End to Mrs. Schlegel. You mean Miss Schlegel, right? You mean now Mrs. Wilcox, right? So Margaret, right? So and he's not giving the house. Let's be absolutely clear. He's not giving the house to Margaret. He is bequeathing, or he will leave the house to Margaret. Margaret will inherit Howard's End at Henry's death. So it's not at the point that he is giving the house to her now, which is a little bit of a different thing. And actually that could be an indication that maybe Henry hasn't changed, because if you recall, even when Henry was married to Ruth, Howard's End belonged to Ruth. It didn't belong to Henry, it belonged to Ruth. But here, Howard's End belongs to Henry, at least in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of inheritance law that didn't take into account the note that Ruth Wilcox wrote on her deathbed. But I think, what was I going to say? Yeah, it's interesting that he still is keeping ownership of the house even as he's alive, which is a different detail to when he was married to Ruth, because he didn't own the house when Ruth was alive. So that could be an indication of him not necessarily changing his ways. So maybe Zyrother and Tim, you have a point there. But that's another thing that's great about this film. We can look at it in all these different ways. Let's see. Cooper Glover 1972 says he also decided to marry Miss Schlegel, right? Miss Schlegel, showing he does have a tender side, even though he appears uncaring. And let's see. Tim Holmes says at Cooper Glover 1972, I think it was a kind of an inevitability, call it fate or destiny, that she would end up with Howard's End, regardless of whether he actually changed his mind or not. Yes, I think the whole film is set up that way in terms of the symbolism that we follow through, and this idea of a kind of constructed class system. And I say constructed because under the assumption that the Wilcoxes are not a landed aristocracy. And so they are in essence the example of class mobility, if we really think about it. They weren't. My assumption is they weren't necessarily born into. Well, maybe Charles and Evie and Paul were, but what was I saying? Yes, but in any event, there's this idea of them being in a higher class than the Schlegels, and the Schlegels being in a higher class than the Basts, and so. This all breaks down because ultimately the house, which used to belong to this upper strata, now eventually goes down one level. For lack of a better phrase, down one level, and then it goes down one level again once Margaret dies, because it'll go to the son of Leonard Bast. And so there's a symbolism there, of course, which is of course linked to this idea of class warfare, or the breakdown of this notion of one's place in the class strata, if you will. So let's see. Okay. Well, while I'm on the topic, before I go to the live chat, let me now go to the other side of the equation, or one of the other sides of the equation, which is the Schlegels, and by extension, this will allow me to go into the Basts, and then I'll go from there. So, Margaret Schlegel and Helen Schlegel form the other side of this very interesting network of characters, and as I say, so, and there's also Tibby, but it's and Julie, or Aunt Julie, but it's more or less. It's more or less Margaret and Helen, and that wonderful relationship that the two sisters have at the beginning, which is threatened by the emergence of the Wilcoxes, but also the emergence of the Basts, in particular Leonard Bast, and I'll try to get to that in a moment. But Helen and Margaret are in many ways very similar, but they're also in many ways very different, and I think that relationship is very key. They seem to have somewhat of financial security, although it's not as, we assume it's not as high a financial situation as, say, the Wilcoxes. They seem to they are of course very intelligent, and they are also not just intelligent, but they are also seekers of knowledge and seekers of wisdom, and so they are ever learning, or they are reading, and they are always trying to talk and learn from people and be clever and all those things. However, we can see that Margaret seems to be the person that can have her feet in both worlds, as it were, the world of the Wilcoxes and Henry Wilcox in particular, and then the world of the Schlegels and Helen Schlegel in particular, and we know this because when Margaret and Henry get together, it is she who's almost like a bridge between those two worlds, and even though she's trying to be a bridge, she tends to side more with Henry than with Helen. At least that's what Helen feels, and that also creates a further wedge between the two sisters. But unlike Helen, it seems like Margaret is able to sort of perform a kind of class mobility to the different strata, into the Wilcoxes, and it's not necessarily by design, but it's more by invitation, because it was Henry who first proposed to her in the first place. And actually, now that I say that, I actually should take that back, because Helen too also seems to display a certain sense of class mobility, but in the opposite direction, not in the direction of the Wilcoxes, but more in the directions of the Basts. And this grows because of her relationship with the Basts, and in particular Leonard Bast, as it continues throughout the course of the film, as we all know. So that's an interesting little dynamic that forms between the two sisters. Right, there is class mobility, if we want to think of it in those terms, that each sister displays, but they go in different directions, and so that's an interesting thing. I like that image too, because that reminds me of how Margaret was talking to Ruth when they first met in Ruth's apartment in London, after Paul has gone to Nigeria and Helen has gone to Germany, and they had their little romantic fling, a little bit of a fling that past summer at Howard's End, but now everyone knows that it shouldn't work out and they shouldn't be together. And Margaret has that great phrase, and I paraphrase. It says, like, it's like nature and human nature, and they go apart and they tug, they go at opposite ends of each other. And so that's also what seems to be happening with the Schlegel sisters. One sister is going one direction, and the other sister is going the other direction. And so, but I think that therefore shows the kind of importance, if you will, of of Margaret Schlegel, because even though I describe it in these terms, Margaret Schlegel also seems to, at least in her eyes, try to have another foot in the world of the Basts as well, in terms of how she, at least as she's trying to express it, is trying to help the Basts, and Helen too is trying to help the Basts. And so Margaret seems to be the character that is the one that is figured into all of these worlds, and also she's also figured into the world of Ruth Wilcox, if we think of Ruth Wilcox as being her own separate sphere of ethereal angelic beauty that floats around. There are some references made about how Margaret looks, or the way that she walks about the house is much like Ruth Wilcox. She assumes Ruth Wilcox's place by Henry's side, and of course Ruth Wilcox and Margaret have their wonderful, if brief, relationship and friendship with each other, and they get along. How would Margaret Schlegel put it? They get along quite swimmingly, and so I think there's a really almost a transcendental sense of Margaret Schlegel, or Margaret Wilcox née Schlegel, as depicted by Emma Thompson. And I like how she's trying to almost be a bridge to all these worlds, and she seems like she might succeed in some ways, but she fails in other ways. And so, and then it's in this ultimate expression of tragedy by the end of the film, wherein she right, the bridge is complete. Right, up to now it's been an incomplete or unsuccessful way of bridging all of the worlds, because Henry and Helen were never going to see eye to eye. Tibby and Charles were never going to see eye to eye. Aunt Julie and Charles never saw eye to eye. Leonard Bast and Henry were never going to see eye to eye. And Leonard Bast, and even Leonard, right, and so all these things never really materialize, but in an interesting way, in a symbolic way, they materialize by the very end, because Howard's End eventually will go to Margaret, and then to Leonard Bast's son, Helen's son, and Leonard Bast's son, her nephew. And so by that progress of events, we have sort of the completion, if you will, of this unifying force that Margaret Wilcox seems to be, and she fulfills her role. And it's an interesting thing that, in a way, Howard's End is a sort of symbol of that force of unification, if you will, not just the breakdown of the class strata, but a sort of a unifying effect, if you will. The classes are not broken in this viewpoint of the film, but everyone becomes unified and becomes one. And so I like how Margaret is the conduit of that, and it's everything that's through her, and it's through Howard's End, it's through her that this conduit and connectivity where everyone can become one, I think, is fully materialized by the end of the film. And so I like that very much. And again, in Ian Forster's Eternal Worlds Only Connect, and I think Margaret is the conduit for that, and her place in the film, therefore, is absolutely essential. And then when we're talking about Margaret Schlegel, we have to mention, of course, Emma Thompson's performance, which is a kind of career-defining role, a really career-defining role. I love the detail. I don't know if I'm sure those of you who are Oscar Academy Awards experts will know this, but the year that Emma Thompson won Best Actress for Howard's End, it was the year after Anthony Hopkins had won Best Actor for The Silence of the Lambs. And so the tradition at the time was the previous year's Best Actor recipient would be announcing the award for this year's Best Actress Oscar. And so it just so happened that it was Anthony Hopkins who was presenting the Best Actress Oscar. And then I just remember when Emma Thompson's name was announced, he announced it in that so Anthony Hopkins way. He just kind of looked down and he said, and the Oscar goes to, and just said, just almost as a throwaway line, like Emma Thompson for Howard's End, and that wonderful accent that he has. And it was great that she received the Oscar from her fellow actor of the film. And I thought that was a really lovely moment. And that's just an example, of course. I mean, the Oscar is not the only be-all, end-all of her performance, because it's the performance herself that is so wonderful and great. When you see the film again, look at her face. Look at Emma Thompson's face, even when it's not the center of the frame, even when the camera is at a distance. Always look at her face. Whenever a character mentions something, her character, her Margaret, is always listening to every word, or more or less every word. There are some words that escape her. For instance, when when they're at the luncheon with Evie and her fiancé are sort of talking in whispers. Of course, she can't hear that, but every other word that is spoken, whether it's by Ruth or by Henry or by Helen, or even by Tibby, Charles, Leonard, all these words that are spoken, she hears and she registers. And even when she doesn't respond, even when she doesn't say anything, her face registers so much emotion. And it's either disapproval or shock, but it's still a sense of icy calm that is in her face. There's one moment, of course, where she really breaks down in tears, which is at the wedding reception when everyone has left, all the guests have left, and after their fight, she's in her room in front of the mirror in this really just devastating moment with it's just her and us alone. And that's the moment when she really breaks down. But then she builds herself up again, and she has a kind of second wind, if you will, when she's talking with Henry in one of the rooms downstairs. And so I think that is I think that is just an example of the real prowess and power of Emma Thompson's performance. But just look at her face in all the scenes that she's in, and just see how she registers emotion and registers that she acknowledges what is being said. But even when she doesn't say anything, she still acknowledges it. It's really quite remarkable and astounding. So that's Emma Thompson. And then the other side of that equation, of course, is Helen Schlegel, Helena Bonham Carter, and the role that she has. I think her performance also is absolutely a kind of a dynamite performance. She has to portray this kind of how should I put it, like where Ruth Wilcox had to portray a kind of angelic, almost not of this world sort of beauty. Helen has to portray a sort of earthiness in terms of her beauty. And her beauty comes out in the way she expresses herself, and also in the way she carries herself, and the way she tries to care for the people around her. Even when she is somewhat, maybe when she's somewhat absent-minded, she's still trying to show how much she cares. And that's, of course, expressed through her relationship with Leonard Bast, which is also one of the key relationships in the film, and I'll get to that in the next segment. But just to hold on the performance by Helena Bonham Carter here for a moment, it's the yin to Emma Thompson's yang, I think, in many ways. And she also has to portray a sense of exaggerated gestures that must contrast with the almost cruel stillness of Anthony Hopkins' Henry Wilcox, especially if we think that Helen and Henry are, in a sense, battling over the soul of Margaret, and so they have to present different sides of that equation. And if we're looking at it in those terms, I think the contrast in the performance styles between Anthony Hopkins and Helena Bonham Carter, I think, is absolutely spot on par. And so I would again draw your attention to the real effervescent energy of Helena Bonham Carter's performance here as Helen. So, and then we'll get to her performance with, or we'll get to Helen's relationship with Leonard Bast and Margaret's too in the next segment. But let me go to the live chat here, and then we will continue onwards. Okay, so let's see. Wolfgrat says, I think Mr. Wilcox is attracted to Margaret, and he probably cares for her as he did for the first Mrs. Wilcox, not just as a possession, but in a careless way. Zyrother says he certainly does have strong emotions when confronted about Mrs. Bast. Yes. Well, it's clearly an amazing film given that everyone has different views of the same characters. That's a very good point, Zyrother. That's a really, really good point. Wolfrat says, I can retain some sympathy for Mr. Wilcox, but plainly he doesn't fully engage or connect with others. He will not feel for others or acknowledge their pain. It is part of the struggle of life. That's a really good point, actually. Whereas Margaret seems, and Helen too, but Margaret seems to be of the opposite philosophy, which is she wants to connect with others. Henry doesn't seem to want to do that, and maybe it's in nature. It's in his nature that he's unable to do that, even when he is at his most broken. So I'm not suggesting that he is a character that is trying to connect with anyone. I think I would, if I did, I should try to amend my earlier comments, but say that there is a moment where he is rebuilt, and I think that is also suggested by the fact that indeed Henry and Margaret are still together even after all the stuff that's happened by the end of the film. Let's see. Let's see here. Okay, just I'm gonna. Okay. Just skipping over the comments here. And okay, oh, Alan's here, our dear friend Alan's here. Hello, my friend. Okay, just further discussion of that. Let's see. All right, sorry about this. Okay, just gonna try to skip to other discussions of other characters here. Cinema Dave Media is here. Hello, it's nice to see you. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Christy is here. Hello. Christy, thank you very much. Please extend my regards to your wife, Lacey, as well. Thank you very much. I hope you are all well. Evan Riper is here. Hello. It's nice to see her. It's nice to see you. Let's see. There's a discussion about Howard's End. Cinephiliac 11 is here. Let's see. Okay. Yes. Wolfgratz says, I also know, by the way, that they let Howard's End unfurnished. Yeah, so I was wondering what happened to the old furnishings. I have this suspicion that the first thing they did when Mrs. Wilcox died was sell her stuff. Actually, I was wondering that too, because, right, you're absolutely right. It is unfurnished, which does allow for the Schlegel's furniture to go into Howard's End, and that's one of those great moments where we find out that the rug is a perfect fit, and also the Schlegel father's sword is also a perfect match on the wall, and so that of course leads to a very difficult situation later on in the film, of course. But yeah, that's a really good point. I was wondering that too, and there's no reference made explicitly in the film, of course, but it's it is possible that they could have sold Ruth's belongings, or they could have consolidated into a different property, right? In what was it? Henry says that they have a property in Mayfair, I think. So, but yeah, anything's possible, I suppose. But it does, right? It wouldn't surprise me if Henry decided to sell or give away the property. Let's see here. Cooper Lover 1972 says maybe the Helena Bonham Carter character represents humanity. Well, Well, actually, let me, while I'm on the topic, I should also just mention, therefore, the other key component of this film, which is the Basts. And this is actually a very important relationship because it, of course, expresses one of the class strata that I was trying to refer to earlier, which is the lower class. And he is not only not necessarily well off, he is also a man who, I'm talking about Leonard Bast, he is a man who is obviously a dreamer, and he is someone who wants to think of things beyond what his current world situation is. I'm not necessarily talking about he doesn't necessarily show signs of wanting to leave his class and go into a separate higher class. He's just showing signs of wanting to be free, whatever that freedom means to him. And so so I think there is a real sense of him being a dreamer and wanting to walk and wanting the sense of walking and freedom. And even when the freedom means that you go and can see the sunset, and it just isn't a beautiful sunset, but it's kind of a dull gray. There's a certain disappointment when it comes to a sense of freedom that he's yearning for. And so it's a kind of a sad statement of affairs, because even when he's trying to yearn for a sense of freedom and he's trying to walk around, he can't even see. It was so dark he couldn't even see the hand held up before his face. But still, he's trying for something that is not necessarily his own life, and but the real world circumstances are such that he has to take care of Jackie. He has to find a job. Later on, he loses his job after he leaves his job for the Porphyrion, and he's unable to get gainful employment. And obviously, also we understand that he's very ill at the later stages of the film, which also probably has something to do with how he reacted when Charles confronted him. We also see him, of course, sleeping upright with the pillow surrounding his ears, and so that's another indication of his illness, of course. But he is a very important character also because of the relationship that is forged between him on the one hand and the Schlegels, in particular Helen Schlegel, but also Margaret Schlegel on the other. And this reveals a lot about the Schlegels, in fact. And the Schlegels see Leonard Bast, at first anyway, as a kind of maybe hard luck case. And at some stages, they almost see him as a kind of social experiment. Remember, after Leonard Bast comes to their house, I think, for the second time, when he goes to the house for the first time after the Music and Meaning lecture, and then some time has passed, and then Mrs. Bast pays a visit because she has a feeling that maybe Leonard Bast had spent the night there, because remember, all that time ago she had found Margaret Schlegel's card fall out of the book that he was reading, and so she has an inkling that maybe he's not being faithful, where in fact he just took a long walk at night and just walked until morning, not telling his wife about that, of course. And then as a result of Jackie's sort of rude visit, he goes and pays a visit to the Schlegels, and then he explains himself, and then he has a warmth to that, and he starts to laugh, and he starts to get to know them, and then cut immediately to a scene where there's a little bit of maybe a weekly gathering among socialites, and they're just about to leave, and Helen and Margaret are just about to leave this gathering of socialites, and they're all talking about Leonard Bast, and it's this idea of, maybe we should give him money, or he is a hard luck case. So he's become this social experiment, as it were, which is in a way a pretty condescending way to consider Leonard Bast in his situation. And I think that's the reason why he refuses the £5,000 check that Helen had insisted Tibby send to Leonard Bast around the later part of the film. And because he has a certain pride, but also you get the sense that he doesn't want to be treated like a hard luck case. And in fact, this notion of someone in a sort of well-off state looking after someone who is sort of in an impoverished state, financially speaking anyway, looking after him and trying to help him is in a way a kind of derogatory or somewhat condescending view of that person who is in an impoverished state. At least there are certain ways of looking at that. And I think Leonard Bast's almost abrasive reaction to the Schlegels is a reflection of how he views what the Schlegels are trying to do for him. Now, the Schlegels might not necessarily look at it that way, or maybe they're not necessarily they don't necessarily act with any intent or ill will or malice. I don't think that's the case at all. But it's just the fact of their acts alone, I think, have a tendency to be condescending, or they can be interpreted as being condescending. It depends on one's interpretation of the film. So therefore, this relationship with the Basts actually sheds new light on the Schlegels' personalities and character traits themselves. They think that they are trying to listen to people and they're trying to help other people, or at least they're talking about those in terms of the suffrage movement, in terms of world peace, etc. But in fact, when they act in a way, even if it's unintentional, and in particular Helen, they act in a way that does nothing but harm to the Basts, and in particular Leonard Bast, all the way down from the little things like Helen inadvertently taking his umbrella, to Helen and Margaret giving him what ends up being the terrible, terrible advice that he should leave the Porphyrion immediately and find other gainful employment. Well, that leads to his financial ruin eventually. And also these other things in terms of him eventually going to Howard's End, which leads to his ultimate death. And so in many respects, Leonard Bast's relationship with the Schlegels really was a kind of it was a fatal one in many respects, because it led to many decisions or many events in his life that ended up being really, really bad for him. And it's even more shocking and tragic too by the very fact that Helen does this stuff almost absent-mindedly or inadvertently, and she doesn't mean any harm, but she is actually causing, in a symbolic way, even to a nominal degree, a certain degree of harm towards Leonard Bast. And even Margaret, as she is drifting away from Helen and more towards Henry, she seems to be less concerned about Leonard Bast and more concerned about Helen. In other words, her trying to act in Leonard Bast's best interest is not necessarily for Leonard Bast, but more for the sake of Helen. So that actually speaks a lot about Margaret's own character and how she is really viewing the so-called lower classes or the hard luck cases, in the sense that when she's talking to Henry, she's not necessarily seeing Leonard Bast as a human being in the same way that she might have seen him earlier on in the film. But in fact, she's looking at him not in his own way, but only in the way that will serve her own interest, in that by helping Leonard, it will help Helen calm down, which will in turn help Margaret in her relationship with Henry. So it's almost like a transactional thing, which is kind of in keeping with her relationship with Henry and how Henry's seemingly trying to exert her influence over her. Or, to interpret it another way, this is another example of how Margaret is someone who has her feet in many different aspects of society, as I was trying to explain it earlier. So however you want to interpret it, whether it's in a more positive light in favor of Margaret or perhaps in a more cynical light in favor of Margaret, in any event, I think something can be said about how she is becoming more and more distant from the cause of Leonard Bast that she once espoused early on in the film. And I think that speaks a lot about Margaret. Of course, there is a kind of ambiguity. Of course, we don't necessarily know how Margaret herself feels about Leonard Bast after Margaret hears the news that Helen is expecting and that Leonard Bast is the father. Of course, we get her reaction when it's Leonard Bast who's the father, but we never get any indication as to how exactly Margaret feels about Leonard Bass now that she realizes what the situation is. Does she have any kind of inner resentment against him, regardless of how Henry might feel towards him? Does she herself have a certain resentment against him? We don't know. We only get that moment when Leonard Bast arrives at Howard's End, and and Margaret just says, and I no, I've not forgotten you, Mr. Bast. And so, but that's the only brief exchange of dialogue that's had between the two of them after Margaret finds out the news about Helen's expecting a child, because after that, of course, Leonard Bast dies in a very tragic way. And so we never get any indication of how Margaret actually feels about Leonard, which might have gone some way to try to interpret whether Margaret's position vis-a-vis Leonard and the hard luck case that he presents is a positive interpretation or a more cynical interpretation. And to be perfectly frank, I don't know which interpretation I would personally espouse. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think it necessarily matters, because as I think Zyrother and other people in the chat have suggested very rightly, this film is open to many different interpretations. And one of those interpretations is, in fact, how morally upright the Schlegels are, and in particular, Margaret Schlegel, how morally forthright she is, or how morally or ethical she actually is vis-a-vis Leonard Bast. I think there's room for a conversation anyway as to the possibility that perhaps she isn't necessarily as morally ethical as she might necessarily want to consider herself to be. And maybe all of that stuff, whether she is the viewpoint of her character is a cynical one or not, let's assume it is. I think she, in a sense, redeems herself by the end of the film, of course, when we realize that the path of Howard's End, in terms of the path of inheritance, the line of inheritance will go from Henry to Margaret to Helen and Leonard's child, her nephew. And so that is in. If we look at Margaret as having a cynical approach towards Leonard Bast's hard luck case, then I think by virtue of the fact that it's going to the child of Leonard Bast is an indication of some kind of redemption. Although we can even say in that line of reasoning, it is going to not only the child of Leonard Bast, but also the child of Helen, her sister. And so maybe it's a sign of her devotion towards Helen more so than her sign of her feelings towards Leonard Bast. Again, we don't know. It's all open to interpretation, but I think it's very fascinating about the film. Again, how does Margaret really feel about Leonard Bast? And I mean that wholly her own viewpoint, not necessarily colored by or influenced by how Henry obviously feels about him, because Henry obviously dislikes him even without necessarily meeting him. And so we all know what Henry's situation is with that. So, but I'm talking about Margaret herself. But I think it's an interesting dilemma that we have in terms of trying to read the Schlegels. Are they as really good characters as they seem to be, at least on the surface? And I don't mean that they mean to be bad. I just mean that maybe they have their actions have unintentional consequences, let's say, and those unintentional consequences lead to very fatal results for one character in particular, Leonard Bast, and also by extension Jackie, because her losing him basically means her losing a kind of lifeline, both emotional and we assume also financial. And so it also could mean, in essence, maybe the death of her as well, which is a really sad thing. Sticking with the Basts also for a moment before I go to the live chat, I also love how the film opens up and introduces us to they're not married when we first see them, but they are living together, and there's a wonderful almost bit of foreshadowing that Jackie seems to express, saying something like how Leonard had been out all day because it was raining and he had to get his umbrella from Helen Schlegel after the music and meaning lecture. And so he had been out all day. He came back and it was kind of late. And so he sees the food on the table. It's just a loaf of bread and some crudely cut up fruit, I think, which is, of course, a really vivid contrast from the really ornate cups of tea and scones that were offered to him at the Schlegel residence. But Also, in that introductory scene of the soon-to-be married Basts, we have Jackie mentioning, "Oh, I thought you would have been crushed in some kind of accident or something and had died." And of course, that's a really chilling foreshadowing because indeed, Leonard Bast will die in a kind of being crushed under the bookshelf in a very terrible accident, and so that sort of thing. That sort of foreshadowing occurs elsewhere. Remember the moment where Leonard Bast is visiting the Schlegel residence before all the Schlegel furniture has been moved to Howard's End. It's still there in the London residence, and there's a moment where he's touching the sword with his hand. It's a kind of a really heartbreaking moment when you realize what's going to happen to him later as a sort of direct result of that sword. But there are all these moments of foreshadowing with the Basts and the way in which the layering occurs in this film is actually quite remarkable. And also, I should mention, I'm sorry, while I'm at the Basts, just one more thing. Samuel West. Samuel West is he plays Leonard Bast, and I love his performance because he has this sort of droopy quality to his posture, and he has his trousers are obviously not well-fitting trousers. His suit isn't quite as clean cut as the Wilcox suits are, although Charles's tailor seems to be a little bit off as well, but in a different direction, I would contest. But that's a different matter entirely. But Leonard Bast, he has a droopy manner when he walks. He also is ill physically, and also perhaps even spiritually or emotionally as well. So that could also be affecting the way he carries himself and his physical demeanor, especially towards the end. But he also has an almost hangdog expression about him. He never smiles except for maybe just a few choice moments. There's one moment when he's laughing in the Schlegel residence, and there's also the moment, it's not necessarily a smile, but it's the moment of ultimate emotional expression when he essentially gives himself to Helen when they're alone in one of the boats there, one of the river rafts there. And so, and I love the symbolism of that, how the boat is supposed to be going downstream in a straight line, but it diverges off to a different path, and it almost goes off script or off screen, which is exactly what happened. At the same time, it was the most symbolic thing that was meant to happen, because if we're talking about a film that is in many ways a sort of kind of merging of the classes, if you will. I mean, this is the ultimate expression of the merging of two separate class strata in one moment of sort of emotional and physical connection, of course. And so there's that, and that's another example of how Helen is going in one direction, and then Margaret, of course, is going in another direction, because, of course, we know that she has her own union, not with Leonard, but, of course, with Henry Wilcox. So, what was I saying? So, yeah, so the Leonard Bast character, and the way he walks, and the way he is what's the phrase? When he's imagining his walks, and when he is in nature, he has a sort of spirit about him that is totally lacking in his real life demeanor and walk and character, such that we realize that he is really almost a broken soul, even with all the stuff that Helen and by extension Margaret, but primarily Helen, are trying to do for him. This is all for naught, ultimately. And so it's even made more tragic because we realize that he has a capacity for a thirst for knowledge, and he wants to learn, and he wants to read, and he wants to have, he has a sort of innate curiosity. He's reading astronomy, which makes him, I think, compelled to want to walk out that night and look at the stars. He often, he often is seen reading, or he is seen thinking or pondering, and the like. But ultimately, what gets him down is his financial situation, and he can't essentially dig himself out of the hole, which has been in essence dug for him rather than him digging it himself, which is even more of a tragic layering to his character, I would say. And also it's something that, as I say, is in many ways due to the inadvertent acts of the Schlegel sisters. And so this is, I think, portraying a very overall tragic character portrait of both Jackie and of Leonard Bast, to the sense that it leads to their ultimate ruin, both of them separately and also concurrently. So this is a really sort of sad part of the narrative, and I think again, just to touch on this one more time, and I'll go to the chat. But I think by thinking about this, and then thinking about how the Schlegels really are acting and are conducting themselves vis-a-vis Leonard Bast, there's actually a lot of room for consideration as to how good the Schlegel sisters really are, in particular Margaret. But I'll leave that to you and your own interpretation of their role and their relationship with the Basts, and we'll go from there. So on that point, I think Zyrother says, Helen feels genuine concern for Leonard, and Margaret at first did too. And Cooper Glover 72 says yes, and he says maybe Mr. Wilcox sees Mrs. Wilcox and Margaret. Okay, so that's another discussion about Mr. Wilcox. And Zyrother on this topic says, I feel really awful for Jackie at the end. We never see what happened to her after Leonard died. Yes, that is exactly, I feel the same way, Zyrother. And then Tim Holmes says, let's see, yes, books and art seem to be essentially a decoration for the Wilcoxes, whereas it is used to express a desire for upward mobility by the lower class Leonard Bast. For the Schlegels, it's more personal. Yeah, and I would actually say that I don't even know if it's upward mobility for Leonard Bast. I would even say that it's almost like an expression of what his innate curiosity is, although it could be a sense of upward mobility. That's a good way of putting it, but I never really thought of it that way in terms of Leonard Bast's character. As far as the Wilcox's demeanor and opinion towards art and literature and music, recall toward the end there when Henry and Margaret are driving to Howard's End with a doctor we assume to be a sort of psychiatrist. And the idea is that Helen is at Howard's End. They sort of lured her, they've tricked her into going to Howard's End in order to pick up her books, because at the time she is now expecting. They don't know she's expecting a child, but they lured her to go to Howard's End because she wants to pick up her books and things. And so the plan is when she's there at Howard's End, that's when Margaret and Henry are going to go there, and they actually bring a doctor with them along the way. So the idea is that if she is indeed unwell, then they can take her away. And the idea of unwell is a sort of maybe she is under some kind of mental strain. That's the implication that everyone has in the discussion of the previous scene. And so, and during that conversation, Mr. Wilcox is explaining to the doctor that she is someone who is into music and art and literature, and so these aren't very sort of respected. So these are indications of her perhaps not necessarily being particularly well, which is actually a very insulting way of putting it. And that's another example where you should look at Emma Thompson's face and what her face registers as she's hearing this talk from Henry, as he's saying this stuff, which is really very disparaging, the way of life and the lifestyle that the Schlegel sisters actually had before Henry Wilcox entered the picture. And so, yeah, so Tim, you're right. I agree with you on that. Let's see. Okay. All right. There's more discussion of Mr. Wilcox and okay. I'm just skipping the conversation here. Let's see. Oh, Chandan Rawal is here. Good evening from India, Daisuke, and everyone. Good evening, my friend. It's nice to see you. And Malika Lakri is here. Greetings from Paris, Daisuke. I'm happy to hear you talk about this movie. Thank you very much, Malika. I'm very glad to hear from you. I hope you're doing well, my friend. Let's see. Okay, so Wolfgratz talking about Ruth Wilcox, as played by Redgrave Sr., is very abstracted, isn't she? That's a good way of putting abstracted. That's an interesting way of describing it. I mean, she's extremely sweet and good-natured, but you can see why the children are dominated by their dad or indeed their society. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Although we never, we kind of get her. Yeah, actually, yeah, that's, although I was going to say that we never get a sense of her family life. We get little glimpses here and there. The opening of the film, of course, she's outside walking around and she's not joining in the indoor festivities, as it were. So she's alone walking. We do see glimpses of her, for instance, we see her when Evie and Henry are at the train station early on in the film. So at St. Pancras Station, I think it is, the plan was for Ruth and Margaret to catch the 5 o'clock train so they could go to Howard's End. But their plans are thwarted, of course, unintentionally because of the early return of Henry and Evie, because they crashed their car. It was a motoring tour trip somewhere, and they crashed their car, and so they came home early, and so they actually met on the platform, which basically ruined the plans of Ruth to take Margaret to Howard's End. And of course Margaret never went to Howard's End ever again while Ruth was alive, of course. So that's what was I going to say? Yeah, so what was my point of that then? So my point of that is that that's an indication of where we see a little glimpse of how Ruth is interacting with her family. We also see a little bit of her and I think Cherries at the very start of the film, and Charles, but that's pretty much it. And so we don't necessarily see her interactions with the family. So I don't know if it's indeed a really strict contrast between Mr. Wilcox and Mrs. Wilcox. It could be that Mrs. Wilcox was very much supportive of Henry, almost doting, because remember what she said about how she is grateful not to be burdened with the idea of voting. And she thinks that maybe there are certain affairs and businesses and decisions that should be left to men. And so that kind of thinking is in many ways in line with, or not consistent, but it is compatible with what we perceive to be Henry Wilcox's patriarchal view of society. And that's not to say anything disparaging against Henry or against Ruth in terms of how I'm trying to analyze it. But but my point is that we don't necessarily see her family interactions, and so I don't necessarily know if it's as a stark contrast as one might otherwise interpret it to be. It could be, certainly it could be, but I think there's interpretation for both possibilities. Let's see here. Okay. Joe LaRocca says, I just ordered this on eBay. Great, well done. I'm glad. I hope it wasn't too expensive, because this can fetch a pretty penny, but hopefully it's not expensive. This was also on a DVD, by the way. Not in the sort of Merchant Ivory collection that was kind of part of the Criterion collection that they did many years back. They released most of the Merchant Ivory films on DVD with a little Criterion collection label on the back there, included in which was a DVD of Howard's End. They didn't have any of the other films after Howard's End, or they didn't have Remains of the Day or anything like that. But it was a good series. It's actually up there. It was one of my plans early on in this channel. In fact, the first thing I was thinking of was maybe doing a video on each of the Merchant Ivory DVDs from the Criterion collection, but it never materialized. But well, that's what we get. Let's see here. Okay, just skipping here. Kubrick Lover 1972 says, totally agree with you, Daisuke, about Mr. Hopkins' complexity. Thank you very much. Yes, it's a very rich performance, I think. And let's see here. Malika Lacry says, do you think that Howard's End is a good choice to discover James Ivory and his work? Yes, I do. It's with the understanding that his career is quite vast, and it also extends to a period of time earlier than Howard's End, and some of his films prior to Howard's End are a little bit different in approach and nature. So in many ways, Howard's End is in many ways, for a lot of people, a kind of culmination up to that point of the Merchant Ivory artistic ethic. But I think it's a fine place to start. It's certainly, I mean, I know that many people enjoy this film very much, and I think it's one that I think one will enjoy on a first-time viewing, or maybe in Zyrother's case, in a second-time viewing, which I'm very happy about, by the way. But I think it's a good place to start. I mean, there are other Merchant Ivory films that I'm sure other people can recommend, but I would certainly recommend Howard's End, that's for sure. Let's see. All right. Let's see. So there's a further discussion of Mr. Wilcox. Here's Zyrother quotes him. Yes, the poor are poor. I pity them. That's life. Yes, he says that in the very great, austere Anthony Hopkins type of way. I really appreciate that. And Wolfgratz continues, yeah, philosophically, he, meaning Mr. Wilcox, is a Darwinist, right? And the struggle of life is very real to Mr. Wilcox, as indeed it is to Bast. Yes, I agree, and I think it's in that kind of context, I think in a very interesting way we can also, and I don't want to focus on this too much, but I think it's very a film that is very convenient also for the times that we live in today, in terms of the way in which Henry Wilcox and the Henry Wilcoxes of the world view the rest of society, and especially view people who are in the strata of society that Leonard Bast finds himself in. And also what Leonard Bast is going through, and the sort of the struggles of him just trying to find a job and not being able to, even though he is doing his best to find gainful employment. And I think there are some perhaps somewhat uncomfortable parallels that one could make to the times that we live in right now. And I think in that sense there is, of course, in a very cinematic, almost poetic way, there is a kind of magical thing that happens at the very end. At least I think one can look at the very end of the film and how Howard's End ultimately goes back to, well, it will go back to Margaret, and by extension to Leonard Bast's son. And so I think that is in a way almost cleansing, a cinematic way of cleansing the issues that are being proposed here by this film, namely about a kind of really almost potentially destructive form of class warfare. If we think of the Darwinist approach of Henry Wilcox being a mode of this class warfare, and the end results, or the consequences of that are that people like Leonard Bast will suffer. And I think that is something that is perhaps something that is unfortunately an aspect that is all too familiar to many parts of societies around the world. And so I think there's a certain immediacy to this film even now, and even with very recent events in some parts of the world, this has a certain immediacy even now in terms of the haves and the have-nots, and so it does have a certain strength to it. And so to our dear friend Malika, who is asking about, is this a good place to start in terms of James Ivory? Yes, and also it's a good place to start because it has a very quite potentially immediate and potent message about not only the society that's depicted in Howard's End, but also the society that we perhaps find ourselves living in right now. And so, yeah, it's unfortunately it does feel like it's a film that has more comment to say about modern day living than one might be comfortable with, I think. So, but let me just leave it at that. Let's see. Okay. Wolfgrat says, but there was a buffet car on the train to the wedding. Let's face it, Helen isn't necessarily that practical either. Yes, Ruth said Helen definitely wanted to create a scene. Yes, I do love Helen, Wolfgrat says, but but she would drive you around the pictures. Wolfgrat says, yes, the other question, I've never been sure the jury would have sent Charles down, but that second hiding of his face by Hopkins was brilliant. Yes, that thing. And right, I agree with you, Wolfgrat. I think if Charles hadn't blurted out that whole bit about the sword, I don't think it would have been, no one would have said anything. And I think Helen and Margaret might have said something because they were witnesses to the event, of course, but maybe they wouldn't have said anything in order to avoid a scandal. But the result of that would have been that Margaret would have left Henry and just gone to Helen, because that's what she said at the end there, which is, my life was with Helen now. And so, but it's a question as to whether Margaret would have indeed said something at the inquest, or she would have protested. In fact, it was Charles who actually initiated the accident in the first place. But yeah, it's an interesting question that, of course, the film doesn't answer. But yeah, what we can assume that Charles is a very maybe overly arrogant person, and I think it's due to his insecurity and also his almost tense relationship with his father. It's not a smooth sailing relationship, of course, and also it's due to the fact that he does have a certain sense of insecurity, and also he has this sense of trying to almost outshine his position in terms of his perspective and his own perception of his own position in society, and he just takes it too far. Really, he does. But he had that volatility in the beginning. Just look at his reaction to Aunt Julie when she tries to visit Howard's End at the very beginning, and they had that little. It's played for laughs. It's a little bit of a comic scene between the two of them in the motor car, but you can even tell in those moments he has glimpses of a sort of a temper that seems to come out in a sort of quietly vicious way. And of course, we understand that it really comes out explosively at the end there, of course. But that's great. Incidentally, the actress who plays Aunt Julie, right, it's Prunella Scales, right? So she's the mother of Samuel West, who's the actor who plays Leonard Bast. So that's an interesting thing. Although I don't think there's a scene together. There's never a scene together between Aunt Julie and Leonard Bast, is there? I don't think there is, but that would have been interesting if they had a scene together. But that you can't force the story like that. Anyway, let me just continue with the chat and just go from there. I have just a couple more things to say about the film, and I will be gone. I will be gone I will close the live chat or the live stream. So maybe in about another 30 minutes or so. And let's see. Okay. Oh, yes. Wolfgratz is talking about the bookshelves. Don Pride, hello, my friend, again. At first I thought the music was by Philip Glass. Yes. Richard Robbins and Percy Granger. Yes, so Richard Robbins, yes, thank you very much for bringing up the score. The score is fantastic, and yes, I've just quoted Zyrother. The score is fantastic. I agree. The score is fantastic, and this is all sort of the artistry of the film, and I just want to get to this in a moment. There's a lovely piano theme that is a kind of a melancholy theme at the beginning. It's also a sort of yearning theme, and there is a way in which the music is kind of uppity in certain parts of the film, but it's not overbearing. There's a particular moment, though, which I think is a really lovely bit of music that we hear, I think, twice. Once early on in the film, and second reprised at a very key moment, which is this little almost staccato, or a kind of a telegraph, like not Morse code, but kind of a telegraph, kind of a sort of motif that we hear twice. Once where it's Jackie and Leonard Bast in their very small lodgings, and they're about to have a little frolic, as it were, and we hear the little theme come in. And the theme comes in again much later in the film, where Leonard leaves the house, which we understand to be for the last time, and he goes to Howard's End after having learned from the maid that Helen is at Howard's End now. And so, and we see him walk down the street, and then we see it cut to a train cutting through the landscape, and then we understand that Leonard Bass has now arrived in the countryside and is on his way to Howard's End. And all the way through that, we hear that staccato theme, which I think it's not the main theme of the film, mind you, but it's a very memorable aspect of this film, and I really, that's my favorite bit of the music in a score that I think is filled with a lot of beautiful, lush tones. But that particular driving, almost sense of destiny to that particular moment. It's also very dark. It has moments of levity in it, but it's overall a very dark piece of music, and I really appreciate that. It's a beautiful score. Really, really beautiful. As I say, that's I mentioned it before, but I'll say it again here. That piece of music, that's the piece of music that I listen to often when I'm walking my dog. So I kind of have a little bit of a self-association, I suppose, with the artistic ambitions of Leonard Bast, at least in terms of when I'm walking my dog. So it's really good dog walking music, I must say. Let's see. Okay. Yes, Don Pride is explaining. Yes, the Robbins, the film score by Robbins definitely has that minimalism feel. As I agree. And Wolfgang, how about why a goblin? Yes, music and meaning, my friend. Does music really have meaning? Yes, very interesting. And for Wolfgang, yes, right. The whole concept of music and meaning. Yes. Malika Lacri says, I think that this edition in the Criterion Collection is the best way to watch it in the best quality. And Zyrother answered the question. Thank you. The Cohen Media Blu-ray from 2016 is the best Blu-ray. I agree. This is out of print, and so I don't think it's unless you can find it for a really, really cheap price, or if you're a collector of Criterion. I don't know. It's the Cohen. I think the Cohen Blu-ray is the best way to go with this film, to be perfectly honest. Just considering that this is out of print, at least for the time being. But if you have the Criterion, I think it's perfectly appropriate and fine, very adequate. But again, if you're looking for the Criterion, just make sure you're finding it for a not so expensive price, because this is out of print, and sometimes out of print Blu-rays and DVDs from Criterion can fetch a pretty penny. So just be sure that if you are looking for the Criterion one, make sure it's in good condition. Make sure you can get pictures from the seller, just in case. Make sure they can show you the back of the disc as well, just to make sure that there are no scratches or anything like that. And also make sure you ask for pictures of the booklet so there are no rips or tears or anything. And also make sure that the price is to your liking, because you don't want to pay an exorbitant amount of money for something that is you can probably find under other labels for considerably less amount of money. So All right, so let's see here. All right. I am... So we're going back to the early part of the film in music and meaning and those scones. So and tea, yes. And Don Price says, now I'm getting I'm getting hungry for those scones now. It's great. Um, all right. So okay. So now we have. Let's see. Carl's Rants and Reviews is your high die scale. I absolutely loved this movie. Sad but very good. Yes, I agree. It is sad, but it is also very good. I agree. Um, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. Wolfgratz and Zyroth are talking about the Bast's place being like a brothel, and Wolfgratz opines that I don't think they got it because it just looked like an over fussy late Victorian lower class joint to me. And Zyrother adds, looks like it was an industrial area right next to the train tracks. Yes, it was. So it wasn't. Yeah, I don't. In those details anyway, I don't see any indication in the visual tableau of this being any kind of brothel establishment. It could be, and I just didn't get those details. And that's not to make any comment about Jackie and what her particular situation is, of course. But I don't think that's what you're talking about, Wolfgratz. But let's see here. Okay. Yeah, and speaking of Jackie, Wolfgratz says, I think Henry's just indifferent well until he encounters Jackie anyway. Mr. Wilcox is not a man who thinks deeply. I think that's a good point. He's not a man who thinks deeply, but he doesn't care about that stuff. Not as much as the Schlegels do, that's for sure. And let's see, okay. All right. Let's see. Wolfgratz says, I have a 25th anniversary edition with American commentators who don't quite get the class differences all the time. They definitely didn't get that the Wilcox family are new money. Okay, yeah. Because let's see. Okay, I've just skipped the button here. All right. Sorry about this. It's great. Okay. All right. Okay, let's see. Sorry about this. I've just skipped down the okay, here we go. Okay. Now there is a discussion of the releases. What's better, the Criterion or the Cohen release? I don't have the Cohen release because I have the Criterion release. So, but I think many other people here have the Cohen release. Kubrick Lover 1972 continues. Maybe Henry feels broken by his affair with Mrs. Bass, so he puts on an appearance. That's a possibility. We're not quite sure what the source of his guilt is, whatever that may be. Maybe he's guilty that he cheated on Mrs. Wilcox, or maybe he is guilty, maybe he feels guilty that, or maybe he doesn't want any whiff of scandal. He just wants to brush everything under the rug, as it were, permanently. Let's see. The release is very good on direction and cinematography. Perhaps, Wolfgratz says, perhaps a bit obsessed over flowers, but good on stairways. Yeah. Zyrothis is probably more embarrassed. He always tries to, talking about Henry Wilcox and Jackie, he always tries to have a hard exterior. His affair with essentially a child back then clearly goes against that image, yes. Okay, so here we have, I hope I pronounce this correctly, Zodikon. Hello, Daisuke. Hello, Zodikon. Let's see, just skipping down here. Andrew says, the carpet being a perfect fit seems to me to be saying how well the Schlegels, specifically Margaret, fit into the wealthy family, and how after their marriage she tended to side with Henry over Helen. That's a good way of interpreting it, actually. Yes, and it's also, that's one way of interpreting it. Also, another way to interpret it is not necessarily the fact that it's a wealthy family that she's able to connect with, but the actual fact that it's Howard's End that she's able to connect with. And if we think of Ruth and her connection with Howard's End, if we think of Ruth as being somewhat delineated or separated from or segregated from the rest of the Wilcox clan, in the sense that she is this sort of angelic, this angelic person, not necessarily driven by the world of finance or the world of property or new money, but she thinks of Howard's End as a kind of extension of one's individual personality rather than a symbol of power and ownership, then I think we can see the fact that the Schlegel's rug fits in perfectly. It's sort of almost like it's not necessarily just fitting into Henry's world, but it's also fitting into Ruth's world via the Howard's End reference. So I think either of those interpretations is possible, but among those, Andrew, I think is your interpretation, which is really good. And it fits, does it not? Because we do see also, as Andrew, you're suggesting, that her attitude changes over time in the film, because, as you rightly suggest, she seems to be siding more with Henry than she does with Helen, which is really great. So well done, well spotted, Andrew. I like that. Oh yes, Wolfrat says, I was wondering if anyone else found the title music jarring. That huge, dun, dun, yeah. It's a little bit of a, and it goes into the soft melody. Yeah, I think it's really great, because it's I think the jarring effect is really effective, because it's what I was saying at the very beginning of this, which is how I was young and I thought of this as a kind of a costume drama. Well, that opening phrase, that loud, bombastic phrase for the credit for the title, Howard's End, I think is really great, because it's suggesting that this is going to be a really powerful, impactful, explosive work, and indeed it is, in terms of the narrative and how it progresses, and all the things that we were talking about today. But so I think those opening few refrains, or that bar or whatever, is actually quite, and it's a very forceful set of notes, and the orchestra is going full blast. I think that's very much, it's jarring, but I think that's the point, because this film is not a kind of quiet film. It's very, well, let me put it another way. It's quietly devastating, and I think that the fact that it's devastating makes the opening sequence and the jarring nature of it quite fitting, I think. But that's just me. Let's see. Yeah, there is. Let's see here. Okay, Wolfgratz, our dear friend, you're great, absolutely great, my friend. Okay, so let's see. Tim Holmes says, I think the music was intended to be jarring. Yes, so we're on the same page, I think, Tim, as though to prepare us for some unexpected events which might happen quite abruptly. Oh, Tim, as always, you have we think alike, but you have a way of saying it much better than I. Oh gosh, I wish I read your comment first before I spoke aloud, but thank you very much. I completely agree with you 100%. Let's see here. Mike Eli says, and Zyrutha says, with the end title music, yeah, it was quite jarring. Yeah, that little kind of jaunty music at the end is very interesting. Yeah, and Mike Eli says, I'm with you, Wolfgratz, in regards to the title music. There's something very jarring about it. Yeah, Wolfgratz. Yeah, when Anthony Hopkins pronounces the word Clark, he's not. It's not a full Clark, but it's a kind of it's not clerk, but it's not Clark, but it's kind of closer to Clark, but it's a little bit in between, so it's Clark, something like that. It's not clerk, right? Yes. Yes. And let's see here. All right. Gosh. Kubrick Lover 1972 says, maybe all these characters are karmically predestined to move the plot forward and make the story go in a certain direction. Oh yes, I completely agree. I like the way you phrase that. But yeah, there is a kind of a progression going forward. Again, I make the reference to the work that wasn't expressly talked about, I think, in the film, which is only Connect, but there is a sense of there being a kind of it's a world of coincidences that moves towards a sort of inexorable climax, and also the epilogue, which then really, in an interesting way, one can see the epilogue as sort of setting the world right, and all the things that were set wrong during the whole progress of the film are now set right in a sort of ironic, poetic way, in terms of the line of succession falling to the son of Leonard Bast. Okay, let's see. Okay, all right. Well, the Schlegels mean well, but they are just as unconnected from those they care for as the Wilcox clan really. Yes, actually, I agree with you, Wolfgratz. I agree with you 100%. They're not as connected as they might seem to think they are, which is why I doubt Forster's, thank you, attempt at a happy ending. Cooper Klepper, 1972, maybe the Beethoven lecture is an allusion to something in the plot of the film. As Zarathustra says, mostly saw that lecture as a way of the upper class presenting to find deep meaning in everything they do. Yes. Yeah, and Wolfgratz as well, the Beethoven bit is enormously cut down from the book. In the end, of course, Bast just denies its importance, laughing at the dawn. Let's see. West, Wolfgratz says West, as in Samuel West, is so good in this film. I've always liked the guy both on film and stage. I've never seen him on stage. I've always wanted to see him on stage, actually. But yeah, he's so good in this. Yeah, I mean, a lot of attention is given, of course, to Emma Thompson and Anthony Hopkins, but I think, and Helena Bonham Carter, but I think also Samuel West really is the third key component in that triumvirate. If we're talking about the Basts and the Basts and the Wilcoxes and the Schlegels, I think that's he, of course, represents that very much. So his performance is really brilliant. It's very physical. I mentioned before, it's very physical, and there's this way in which he doesn't outwardly show his sickness, but you can tell that he is very, very sick. So, yeah, really great. Okay. Okay. Talking about the stars, yes. Wolfgratz says, according to Leonard, the stars are important. Yes. Speaking of which, by the way, isn't it typical that Helen is completely wrong about the pulsar? So you're talking about the fact that, right, she just, if you follow it, you just get lost or something. I think that's what she says when they're going up to coffee, right? And then let's see here. And yeah, Wolfgratz says that Helen is sure that the pulsar travels about and you get lost following it, when the whole point is that it does no such thing. So I think you're suggesting the hypothesis of this particular live chat, namely that Helen is somewhat absent-minded. She means well, but she is an absent-minded intellectual. Let me put it that way. Let's see here. Cooper Glover says the star scene maybe symbolically represents the fates of the characters. Perhaps. Zyrotha says maybe she means that following a set, simple goal is not the right way. Go your own way and find what works for you. Oh, I like that, Zyrotha. I like that very much. Yes. Kubrick, Lover 1972 says Helen makes a mistake at the start by trying to forget with making love to that person at the start of the film. Who is that person, Charles? No, that was Paul, not Charles. So that was, and that's in fact Aunt Julie's. Aunt Julie makes that same point as well. So yeah, so that's the younger son, Paul, who goes to Nigeria. Let's see. And Wolfgrat says, yes, they're... Okay, so this is referring to my kind of comment about how the train station that Margaret and Ruth were going to go to, they're going to go to St. Pancras Station, catch the 5 o'clock train. And so Wolfgrat is responding to that. Yes, they are distracted at St. Pancras. St. Pancras, excuse me. What did I say? St. Pancras? I meant St. Pancras. But others, other than that, seeing Henry off in the car, we hardly ever see Mrs. Wilcox with her family. She just sees them having fun for once through the window. Yes. And Wolfgrat says that was Paul. Yes, talking about the fling that Helen had at the very start of the film. Yes, and just before he's packed off to Nigeria. Yes, he goes to Nigeria. Let's see here. Gosh. And now we're talking about the children here. Wolfgrat says Paul is probably the least unacceptable of the children, but then we don't see much of the poor soul other than him cutting off Helen and telling her what a good sport she is. Oh, and on that bike. And then we see her at the very end when the whole family's assembling, agreeing about the house going to Margaret at Henry's death. And I think he's got a mustache on there as well, right? And he says, you know, it's not the country and it's not the town either, I think. Kubrick Lover 1972 says maybe Helen and Henry can be tied together in that they both had affairs before meeting Leonard and Margaret. And Wolfgrat says, of course, the Basts used to work on the land. So there we are. It goes full circle, I suppose. Yes, very interesting. And it's interesting to also to tie to that symbolically. The place that we see, Helen and her son, and also one other child who I think is maybe I think one of I want to say it's one of Charles' children, but I'm not quite sure because it's the 3 of them. But I was going to say that they're on the land, and we actually see the land being worked on with being cut as they are on the land, but then the rest of the family are driving off. And so that's also kind of symbolic link back to the land, I suppose, and the son of Leonard Bast. Let's see. Kubrick Lover 1972 says, so Helen maybe can't be totally innocent, playing devil's advocate, I guess. Kubrick Lover 1972 continues, Charles is a spoiled brat. Yes, that's one way of looking at him. And Wolfgrat says, I'm not, let's see, laying any money on what happened between Helen and Paul, but it is a better kiss than Margaret bestows on Mr. Wilcox. Yes. Actually, that's a really good point. I don't know exactly what happened between Paul and Helen either. My sense is that it was just a little nighttime kiss. I don't know if there was anything more than that. I can't even begin to imagine what the logistics of that could be. But I don't think that's the point of the scene. But I think the point is that it was a kind of innocent little fling that was just dashed. And so I don't know to what extent that was an affair to the same degree that the affair between Jackie and Henry was. But again, this is all, based on our own interpretation, of course. Okay, let's see here. So, all right, so I have got to go in about 5 minutes because, let's see, And yes, thank you very much, Wolfgratz. So you're trying to remember it, but you don't think Sam and Prue share a scene. So thank you very much. I don't think they do either. It wouldn't make sense that they would anyway, because their characters are in completely different stratospheres, as it were. So it would make sense that they don't share a scene, because Aunt Julie is also very limited in her scenes as well. She's either complaining or sick or doing something else on holiday, but that's basically it. I think she was also in the scene where they're in Devon. I think where she was in Devon with Margaret when Henry sent the telegram inviting her up to London to look at a house, which would then be his ruse to try to, in a sense, proposition her and actually propose marriage to her. But I think they were in Devon, right? And that's where Aunt Julie was. So, of course, Leonard Bass wouldn't have been in Devon, of course. So there wouldn't have been any instance where mother and son would have been in the same scene. But oh well. Okay. Let's see. All right. Okay, I've got to just skip down here. I'm sorry. I'm skipping down the chat. I really apologize, especially to Wolfgratz and Zyroth and Cooper Glover 1972. Thank you very much for this. But I really have to go. The battery power on my phone is almost 0%. So okay. So our dear friend Eddie Green's 101 is here. Thank you very much for tuning in, my friend. Thank you. I appreciate it. Don Pride says, nice chat, Daisuke, signing off to go on my bike ride. Oh, please enjoy. Please enjoy it. Thank you. And my wife Sally also enjoyed her. Oh, Don, thank you very much. I think I received a comment from your wife in one of I think it was the poll, I think, or something. So I haven't responded yet, so I apologize. Please tell her that I apologize for not responding to her comment yet, but I will very soon. So thank you very much. My warmest regards to you. Thank you. Okay, so Wolfgratz, thank you very much. Yes, Aunt has gone down to Devon, and very nice too, but difficult to get around, but better than Cornwall. Really, I always thought Cornwall was really nice. I'd visited once. It was very nice. I'd never visited Devon though, but I'd always wanted to go because of certain connections that were made with Agatha Christie, but okay. But that's a story for another video. But okay, my friends, so let us wind up this discussion. I think it went very, very nicely, I think. Very nicely indeed. I spoke more or less about what it is I wanted to say, prompted, of course, by your great comments and confirmations. Thank you very much. And so thank you very much for that. And I'm just quite taken with this film, and I think there is what I've taken from the chat is that there is much more room for interpretation in different directions than perhaps I had initially realized. Although I do acknowledge that this film does open itself up to a number of interpretations. So thank you very much for this opportunity, my friends. So this is Howard's End from 1992. So in the off chance that you are still here and you haven't seen this film, I very much apologize, but we did talk about a lot. Maybe the details weren't, maybe they were described in a sense that maybe you could still watch the film and not necessarily realize certain plot events. So I hope that's the case. But in any event, if you are still here and you haven't seen the film, please, I urge you to see the film. It's really quite fantastic for a number of reasons that I think many of the people in the chat were talking about. So thank you very much for stopping by and for allowing me the opportunity to talk about this film, Howard's End, the James Ivory film, Howard's End, Ismail Merchant film with Prala Jabala and others. So really, really important, significant work. As I say, very timely. Even now, I think quite, one can argue that it is very, very timely indeed, but it still holds on to remnants and functions and details of a kind of distant past that no longer is, but still with certain currents of emotion and concern that resonate, I think, with us even now. So Strongly recommended if you haven't seen it already, but I hope you have if you've made it this far. So my friends, this is Howard's End. So thank you very much for sticking around as always. I really appreciate it. Next time we will be talking about the film, what was it, Heat, right? Heat, the Michael Mann film Heat. And so if you want to join me for that conversation, please feel free to stop by next Saturday. Same time, same place, so Saturday, 11 p.m. I will make an announcement later on this channel with respect to that. I think there's another poll as well that's still open about what trilogies we should talk about. I don't know. I haven't checked the poll lately, so I don't know what the trilogy is winning at the moment, but that's still open for a few more days. So I think it's open until the end of the month, so just a little bit less than a week. So if you haven't voted in the poll, please feel free to do so, and we'll see what the results are, and we'll go from there. So I'm looking forward to that very much. Again, it's a slightly different mode of, it's a slightly different mode of film chat or film club live stream, but I think it's always good to try new things, even if even if I fail. It's still good to try new things. And also, as I mentioned earlier in a separate video, even if we do a trilogy, I will still try to alternate between a trilogy film and a separate non-trilogy film. So just to be sure that no one is felt like they're left out in the cold, as it were. Because I know that trilogies can be expensive and maybe a little bit difficult to get one's hands on. So with that, my friends, that's it from me. So until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well. Please take very good care of yourselves during this time. I mean it. Take very, very good care of yourselves. It's important. And I think, of course, we all know the reasons why. It's a very strange, terrible, stressful time. And I mean, I really hate to say it, but unfortunately, the effects of this particular situation that we find ourselves in now will probably be felt, likely be felt for a long, long time. And so I really want to once again express to all of you my warmest regards, and please continue to take very good care of yourselves and stay strong, my friends. Stay strong, healthy, safe, and be as strong as you have always been. You have always been strong. You have always been strong-willed, and you have never let any sort of tough challenge or toughness or any kind of terrible thing get you down. It might get you down momentarily or temporarily, but it never gets you down completely, because you always get up. And I know this about you. So just continue to stay strong like you always have done, my friends. And we will win. We will beat this, right? So just continue to be well. My warmest regards to you. And yes, just keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So thank you very much. It is approaching 2 a.m. where I am. So I am about to go to sleep. And with that, thank you and cheers. All right, so let's see. Okay, oof, my leg hurts because I have been sitting here in this. I don't know if you know this, but I don't sit on a chair here. I sit on the floor because I have a little bit more of a. It's a little bit easier for me to sit on the floor, and I have some cushions here to sit on, so it's not a completely hard surface. But once in a while, and this is true also when I'm sitting in chairs for a long time, I tend to get a little bit stiff in my legs here, and so maybe I should try to do a live stream standing up and walking around one of these days. That might help. But oh well. I hope you don't mind this sort of meaningless chat at the end of the live stream. But, if you do, you can always turn it off. And of course, I'll see you next time. Last thing is, I was going to say something, but I am a little bit I am spent of energy, I must admit. That took a lot out of me, but that was good. That felt really good. I was something that I've always wanted to talk about, that film, Howard's End. And I was actually debating, should I do Howard's End, or should I do Room with a View, or should I do Remains of the Day, or Morris. I was thinking of doing Morris. I really cherish that film very much. That is such a, talk about a devastating film, and also a beautiful film at the same time. Wow, Morris. Maybe one day that can be a topic of another live stream discussion, but in the meantime, we were able to talk about Howard's End, so that's always very good. So anyway, my friends, sorry to keep you, and stay safe and be well, and see you very soon.